For centuries, a rain-soaked island on Europe's edge carved out a realm so vast that, quite literally, the sun never set on its domains. At its zenith, the British Empire spanned every inhabited continent, ruled hundreds of millions of people, and shaped cultures, economies, and political systems whose contours are still visible today. But that power was no accident. It was assembled brick by brick over more than 400 years. How did a small, vulnerable kingdom become the world's preeminent superpower? How did England, once invaded by Romans, Vikings, and Normans, re-emerge as mistress of the seas? This is a tale of adaptation and ambition, conquest and resistance. Wherever the empire planted its flag, it met peoples who fought back, bargained, and ultimately reshaped the empire itself into something diverse, conflicted, and full of internal tensions. In this video, we'll trace the story from the forging of a unified England to the ocean-going revolution of the 16th century, through the rise of Britain's global trading network and the colonial systems that stretched across North America, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and Asia. We'll see how modern capitalism took form in imperial trade circuits dealing in spices, tea, cotton, ore, and in millions of enslaved human beings torn from their homes to feed colonial profits. We'll meet the East India Company, a private corporation that evolved into a de facto government ruling vast populations. Yet empire is never only about conquest. As the 20th century unfolded, Britain faced uprisings, independence movements, and deep political shifts. One by one, its colonies claimed self-rule, and the imperial map faded. What remained was a powerful afterimage: parliamentary systems in South Asia, legal codes in Africa, English as a lingua franca, unresolved inequalities, and the soft power of British popular culture. It is a story that crosses oceans, centuries, and borders, and one that still shapes our present. This is the history of the British Empire. Roman conquest, AD 43, and the Roman withdrawal, c. 410. When the Romans first cast their eyes across the Channel, Britain was a quilt of Celtic polities, Iceni, Trinovantes, Dobunni, Brigantes, each commanding a cluster of hill forts and farming the land with iron ploughs and communal herds. Trade already linked them to Gaul and Iberia. Tin, hides, and slaves crossed the sea in exchange for Mediterranean wine and fine pottery. Druids safeguarded oral law. Warriors measured honor in cattle and gold talks, and chieftains bound followers through gift-giving and raid. To Imperial Rome, the island offered both opportunity and enigma. Julius Caesar's probing raids of 55 and 54 BC proved that legions could reach its shores but failed to impose lasting rule. Nearly a century later, Emperor Claudius, eager for a quick military laurel, dispatched Aulus Plautius with some 40,000 troops. In AD 43, the invasion armada beached in Kent, rolled through the Thames Valley, and seized Camulodunum, modern Colchester, proclaiming it the first provincial capital of Britannia. Conquest advanced piecemeal. Engineers drove stone roads, Watling Street, Fosse Way, across forest and fen, binding forts at Chester, York, and Caerleon into a supply web that could disgorge legionaries in days. Civilian grids arose beside marching camps, basilicas, bathhouses, mosaicked villas, and bustling forums where Latin orders mixed with Celtic brogues. Rome co-opted local elites rather than annihilating them. Sons of tribal kings took Latin names, sat in senates, and retired as decuriones of freshly minted municipia. Cultural fusion ran deep. Jupiter and Minerva shared altars with Sulis and Nodens. Latin became the language of contracts and courts, and by the early 4th century, Christianity claimed martyrs such as Alban and churches at Lincoln and Verulamium. Economically, Britain fed the empire with grain, wool, lead, and especially tin, while amphorae of olive oil and garum flowed north. Country estates adopted hypocaust heating and painted wall plaster, yet beyond the Severn and Hadrian's wall hill fort life endured, only thinly veiled in Roman veneers. By the late 300s, fissures showed. Hunnic pressure on the Rhine drew crack. Units back to Gaul, usurpers like Magnus Maximus stripped garrisons to fuel continental ambitions. In 367, a barbarian conspiracy of Picts, Scots, and Saxons breached every frontier at once, exposing how brittle provincial security had become. Repairs were made, but the centre could no longer hold. In 410, Emperor Honorius sent his famous rescript urging the civitates of Britain to arrange their own defence, imperial shorthand for abandonment. Legions decamped, coin shipments ceased, and Roman governors vanished. Villas were subdivided, forums became cattle yards. In some towns, locals stripped the lead roofs for barter. Yet Rome left indelible legacies: 16,000 kilometers of roads, a lattice of walled cities, a syncretic aristocracy conversant in Latin law, and the very idea that disparate tribes might coexist under a single administrative canopy. Those assets, and the vacuum Rome created, would shape every struggle that followed. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, down to 5th, 7th centuries. Rome's retreat opened Britain to the thunder of oars. From the North Sea's grey horizon came Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, war bands from present-day Germany, Denmark, and the Low Countries. At first, they were hired swords, invited by Romano-British commanders to beat back Pictish raids. Once ashore, however, they carved out enclaves of their own and summoned kinsmen across the water. By the late 500s, the island was a patchwork of 7 principal realms: Kent, Sussex, Essex, Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, Northumbria, later styled the Heptarchy. Power rested on 3 currencies: land, loyalty, and steel. Each king maintained a comitatus of mailed thegns who swore fealty in exchange for treasure and the right to feast in the royal hall. In battle, the shield wall embodied that bond, living and dying in an interlocked row. Beneath lay free ceorls who farmed hides of land, owed ferd service, and attended local moots. Below them toiled thralls captured in war or born to bondage. Urban, life all but vanished. The tiled villas of the south cracked under weeds, their mosaics quarried for rubble. Economic gravity shifted to rural estates and newly founded monasteries that doubled as granaries, scriptoria, and diplomatic embassies. Material culture simplified: timber halls, thatch, and ring ditches, yet intellectual life regrouped around oral artistry. In smoky longhouses, Scops recited epics such as Beowulf, weaving genealogies and moral codes into alliterative verse. Religion mirrored the migration. Woden, Thunor, and Tiw ruled calendars of blot and oak grove sacrifice. The turning point came in 597 when Pope Gregory III dispatched Augustine to Kent. King Ethelbert's baptism radiated prestige. Missionaries fanned out, founding sees at Rochester, London, and York. Conversion travelled via royal marriages and diplomatic gift exchange. A Kentish princess married into Northumbria, bringing Bishop Paulinus and scriptoria skills. Irish monks from Iona evangelized from the opposite flank, fusing Celtic eremitism with Roman order. Within a century, stone churches studded the landscape, and Latin literacy re-entered Britain through psalters and gospel books. Monastic enclaves, such as Lindisfarne, Wearmouth, and Jarrow, became engines of scholarship. There, Bede the Venerable, d. 1035, penned his ecclesiastical history of the English people, coining the very term gens anglorum. Monks copied Virgil beside vernacular glosses, devised the Northumbrian Renaissance's insular script, and calculated Easter with algorithms that astonished the continent. Culturally, the age forged English identity. Old English, hearty with Germanic grammar yet peppered with Latin loanwords, emerged as the speech of law codes and charters. Artisans blended Scandinavian interlace with Celtic spirals, producing masterpieces like the Sutton Hoo helmet and the Ruthwell cross. Even political fragmentation bred innovation. Royal councils, witenagemots, debated law, while kings like Ine of Wessex issued written statutes anchoring authority in text rather than mere prowess. Yet the tug toward unity never entirely lapsed. Northumbria under Edwin and Oswald briefly dominated from Humber to Forth. Mercia under Offa, i.e. 757-796, projected power deep into Wales and built Offa's dyke to mark its frontier. Offa struck gold dinars modelled on Abbasid coinage, corresponded with Charlemagne, and experimented with realm-wide taxation. Such experiments laid institutional frameworks, coinage, burgle defence, royal writ, that later monarchs would co-opt when a fresh menace, the Vikings, demanded collective resistance. Thus, the so-called Dark Ages were anything but dim. In the crucible left by Rome's collapse, warrior kings, monks and farmers fashioned the legal, linguistic and spiritual bedrock of England. Their descendants would wield that legacy first to withstand the Viking tempest and, eventually, to imagine a single crown commanding the whole island. Viking invasions, 9th century, and the resistance of Alfred the Great. In 793, a thunderbolt struck Christian England. Long, narrow ships slid out of the mist and crashed upon the holy island of Lindisfarne. The raiders, unknown, helmeted figures from the frozen north, killed or enslaved the monks, plundered jeweled reliquaries and vanished before help could arrive. The attack was no mere coastal atrocity, it signaled the dawn of a new age, the era of the Vikings. These Scandinavian warriors, Danes, Norwegians and Swedes, were driven by more than a taste for silver. Population pressures and limited farmland at home propelled younger sons to seek fortunes abroad. Gifted shipwrights and navigators, they mastered clinker-built longships that could skim open sea, churn up river, and be hauled across portages with equal ease. Seasonal raids soon evolved into full-scale campaigns of conquest and settlement. In 865, the so-called Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, a coalition formidable enough to crush entire kingdoms. Within little more than a decade, Northumbria had fallen, East Anglia lay subdued, and even mighty Mercia was carved apart. Only Wessex, tucked in the southwest, still flew the dragon banner of Anglo-Saxon resistance, and there Alfred, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf, inherited a battered throne in 871. Alfred the Great fought with both sword and strategy. He reorganized military service into a rotating levy so that half the warriors were always in the field while the other half tended farms. He ringed his kingdom with fortified towns, the burhs, linked by roads along which troops and supplies could move at speed. He even built a tiny navy, an English first, to harry Viking ships in the Channel estuaries. After years of defeats, ambushes and counter-sieges, Alfred forced the Danes' leader Guthrum to sue for peace. The Treaty of Wedmore, formalized in 886, split the island. Wessex and its satellites remained under Anglo-Saxon law, while the northeast became the Danelaw, governed by Scandinavian customs. Alfred's triumph was as cultural as it was military. Secure behind his burhs, he launched a program of learning, translating works of history, theology, and philosophy into Old English so that all the freeborn youth of England might read them. He standardized coinage, recodified laws, and fostered a court circle that saw scholarship as a bulwark against future darkness. At the same time, everyday contact across the Danelaw frontier left lasting marks. Norse loanwords, sky, egg, law, window, flowed into Old English. Legal ideas, such as the wapentake, mingled with the shire, and hybrid communities sprang up around market towns like York and Lincoln. Thus the Viking onslaught, dire though it was, forged a stronger, more resilient kingdom. By the time Alfred died in 899, he had preserved not merely Wessex, but the possibility of a united England, an idea his descendants would turn into reality. And out of the clash of Mead Hall and Longship emerged a richer, more cosmopolitan culture that would shape the English people for centuries to come. Norman Conquest, 1066, William the Conqueror. The death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066 plunged England into a three-way struggle for the crown. Harold Godwinson, the kingdom's most powerful earl, seized the throne. Across the North Sea, King Harald Hardrada of Norway invoked a treaty to press his own claim, and in Normandy, Duke William insisted that Edward had once promised him succession, a pledge allegedly confirmed by Harold on oath. Harold's first test came from the north. In late September, he marched his housecarls at lightning speed to Yorkshire and shattered Hardrada's invasion force at Stamford Bridge. Yet barely a week later, William's fleet landed unopposed on the Sussex coast. On 14th October, the armies met at Hastings. Harold's shield wall held firm until the Normans feigned retreat, luring English foot soldiers into disorder. A countercharge by Norman cavalry broke the line. Harold fell, legend says an arrow pierced his eye, and resistance collapsed. William advanced methodically on London, accepting formal submissions from shires along the way. On Christmas Day, 1066, he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, inaugurating one of the most transformative reigns in English history. The new monarch stripped almost every Anglo-Saxon magnate of land and titles, granting vast estates to his Norman followers. French, not English, became the language of court, justice, and high culture. Administration grew markedly more centralized. Royal writs now ran across the realm, and in 1086 William ordered the Domesday Survey, a meticulous audit of who held every field, mill, and meadow. The conquest reshaped daily life as profoundly as it redrew the aristocracy. Stone castles, motte and bailey at first, then massive keeps like the Tower of London, dotted the landscape as instruments of both defense and domination. Romanesque churches rose beside them, proclaiming continental artistic ideals. Linguistically, Norman French mingled with Old English to produce Middle English, enriching vocabulary and altering syntax. By binding England to feudal Normandy, William knit the kingdom into the wider tapestry of medieval Europe and laid the foundations for ambitions that would soon reach far beyond the Channel. 100 Years' War, 1337–1450. What posterity calls the 100 Years' War was in fact a series of wars fought in bursts between England and France. It sparked the decision of Edward III of England to claim the French throne through his mother's lineage. French jurists countered that the crown could pass only through the male line, and in 1337 hostilities began. Early English campaigns reaped spectacular victories. At Crises, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, disciplined ranks of longbowmen shredded French cavalry, proving that arrows could unhorse knights and unravel chivalric warfare. Plague and internal revolt sapped both kingdoms, but England, smaller yet better financed, held the upper hand. The apex came in 1415 when Henry V led a rain-soaked army to triumph at Agincourt, archers again deciding the day. For a moment it seemed an Anglo-French dual monarchy was within reach, yet France rallied. Inspired by Joan of Arc and buoyed by improved artillery, French forces retook strategic towns, culminating in the reconquest of Bordeaux in 1453 England, retained only Calais, and with it the grudging realization that its continental empire was over. The war's legacy was decisive. English nobles, bled of funds and manpower, could no longer sustain private armies abroad. Parliament gained leverage through war taxation, and maritime commerce, rather than territorial conquest, emerged as the kingdom's future path. Wars of the Roses, 1455–1487, and the rise of the Tudors. Defeat in France left England inward-looking and politically brittle. Two cadet branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, Lancaster, Red Rose, and York, White Rose, contested the throne, each tracing descent from Edward III. Between 1455 and 1487, the realm lurched through bouts of civil war marked by battlefield, ferocity, rapid shifts of allegiance, and the decimation of aristocratic lineages. Key moments included the Yorkist victory at Towton, 1461, the Lancastrian resurgence under Henry VI's supporters, and the bloody seesaw that followed. The struggle culminated on the 23rd August 1485 at Bosworth Field, where Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian with a tenuous claim, defeated King Richard III. Richard's death, famously in the thickest press of his friends, ended the male line of York. Crowned. Henry VII, the new king, cemented peace by marrying Elizabeth of York, symbolically merging the roses into the Tudor rose. He curbed overmighty nobles through bonds, recognizances, and a professionalized royal council, restoring solvency to the crown. Under the Tudors, England pivoted toward naval exploration, Atlantic trade, and internal consolidation. The first steps on a course that would one day expand into a global empire. Pirates with honor. The Maritime Dawn, 1558–1603. For most of the 16th century, England watched the world be taken by others. While Portuguese caravels and Spanish galleons redrew the map, the Tudor kingdom was still mending the wounds of civil war, fixing its break with Rome, and searching for a stable identity. England's late start would stamp the character of the empire it eventually built. When the English finally joined the overseas game, they did so not as an established power, but as audacious interlopers, sometimes illegal, always opportunistic. The empire they founded first flew the Jolly Roger with a queen's blessing. That queen was Elizabeth I. When she inherited the throne in 1558, Europe seethed with religious wars and dynastic feuds. Protestant England stood isolated, eyed with suspicion by Catholic giants, above all by Spain, then swollen with New World gold and master of the world's strongest fleet. Elizabeth had to secure her realm at home and keep it from being swallowed on the continent. She found her answer on the sea. Enter Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, Walter Raleigh. Not quite navy officers, not quite outlaws, but corsairs, privateers who preyed on enemy shipping under a royal commission. The arrangement was elegantly cheap. The crown risked little money, struck Spanish wealth at its source, and pocketed a share of every captured cargo. The corsairs accepted lethal odds in exchange for adventure, glory, and profit. No name shines brighter than Drake's. In 1577 he sailed ostensibly to explore the Pacific. In truth, his brief was piracy on an imperial scale. Over 3 years he terrorized Chilean and Peruvian ports, eluded ambushes, mapped unknown coasts, slipped through the Strait of Magellan, and in 1580 limped back to Plymouth as the first English. captain to circumnavigate the globe, his hold bursting with silver. Elizabeth knighted him on deck. The gesture told Europe that England would no longer defer to Spanish supremacy and had the seamen to prove it. Private war soon hinted at public empire. Elizabeth and her councillors began dreaming of settlements, new harbours, planted flags, English households on distant shores. Their first attempts were disasters. In 1585, Walter Raleigh's colony at Roanoke struggled with bad soil, poor resupply, and tense relations with local Algonquians. When relief ships returned in 1590, the settlement was gone without trace, the lost colony, a warning that owning land was harder than stealing bullion. Yet the idea had taken root. If Spain could mine an empire from the New World, why not England? Elizabeth, ever pragmatic, knew her kingdom was not ready for full-blown colonization. The time was ripe instead for a new kind of power, maritime and predatory, that paid its own bills. That rivalry reached its apotheosis in 1588. Furious at English aid to Dutch rebels and relentless attacks on his treasure ships, Philip II of Spain launched the Grande Armada, more than 130 ships, intending to invade England and depose the heretic queen. The English fleet was smaller but quicker, commanded by veterans of corsair warfare. Exploiting tidal shifts, they loosed fire ships into the Spanish line, broke its cohesion, and drove it into the teeth of Channel storms. Dozens of hulks littered the Irish coast, thousands of sailors drowned. Spain's aura of invincibility shattered, and England claimed the symbolic birthright of a naval power. From that moment, the sea ceased to be mere moat and became the theatre of national destiny. Controlling trade routes now looked like the true key to wealth. Shipyards multiplied, officers trained in gunnery and navigation, and the rough charts of sea dogs were copied, corrected, and archived. A distinct maritime culture emerged. Captains became folk heroes, the Queen the virgin guardian of Protestant liberty, and the realm itself an idea larger than its island shores. After the Armada, Elizabeth famously told her troops, "I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England." It was conscious myth-making, forging imperial identity out of national survival. Crucially, England's first overseas ventures lacked any master plan. Unlike Portugal or Spain, which had enjoyed royal sponsorship, papal bulls and systematic missionary orders since the late 15th century, the English improvised. Their delay forced them into bolder, riskier methods: piracy, joint stock, adventuring, and the outsourcing of conquest to private capital. That improvisation bred a looser, more flexible empire, one comfortable with subcontracting power to chartered companies. The East India Company, founded in 1600 during Elizabeth's final years, epitomized this logic. Merchants shouldered the danger of distant trade. The state supplied a legal monopoly and the implicit menace of the Royal Navy. Divided risk, shared spoils. The crown was accomplice, not yet direct ruler, but the template for indirect dominion was set. By the century's close, England still lacked flourishing colonies and could not match Spain ship for ship. Yet it had gained something subtler, an imperial mentality. The nation now believed its fortune lay on the oceans, that economic expansion and Protestant mission were intertwined, and that English culture carried a civilizing mandate. Adventure fused with national ambition, religious zeal, and an emerging conviction of providential destiny, ideas that would one day explain, even excuse, British power on every shore. Elizabeth I did not live to see a consolidated empire. She died in 1603, closing a chapter of danger and daring. But her reign had unlocked the cage of insular caution. For the first time, the English stopped watching the world from behind their cliffs and sailed out to shape it. Corsairs, cartographers, Sea captains, and though they rarely said the word aloud, would be colonizers. Thus the British Empire was born with dirty hands, loot, flame and plunder, yet with pride in that very origin. Its earliest champions were not saints or sages, but pirates with honor, and their wake would ripple through the centuries to come. The company that swallowed India. By the end of the 16th century, the world map had already been redrawn by the great European maritime powers. Spain and Portugal, pioneers of the voyages of discovery, had opened routes to the Americas, Africa and Asia, setting up colonies, fortresses and commercial monopolies. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, split the globe in two. The Portuguese would dominate the east, the Spaniards the west. And in this new global chessboard, one region in particular aroused fascination, ambition, and conflict: India. For Renaissance Europeans, India was not a country in the modern sense, but a mythical, commercially strategic region associated with spices, fine fabrics, precious stones, and ancient knowledge. Cinnamon, black pepper, cardamom, nutmeg. Items common today, but then rare and priceless. In European markets, a kilo of pepper could be worth its weight in gold. India also formed a link in the world's oldest trade routes connecting the Middle East, China, and Southeast Asia. Whoever controlled trade with India controlled a large share of the global economy of the day. When the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India in 1498 with Vasco da Gama, they began a new cycle: the European presence on the subcontinent. The Portuguese set up trading posts and fortresses such as Goa, Daman, and Diu, and became lucrative middlemen between Asia and Europe. Throughout the 16th century, they dominated the spice trade, though their presence remained coastal. By the late 16th century, however, other European powers had begun to covet the route, among them England. Emboldened by victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 and by the exploits of corsairs and merchants at sea, the English wanted a slice of that fabulous market. In 1600, a group of merchants received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I, granting them a monopoly on English trade with the East. Thus was born the Honourable East India Company. This was no ordinary company, it was a hybrid entity, privately run yet state-backed. It could arm ships, raise armies, sign treaties, mint coin, judge, and execute. In other words, the company could act as a state within a state, and that is exactly what it did. In its early years, the company merely jostled with the Portuguese and later with the Dutch VOC. The English built their first coastal outposts. In India, Surat, 1612 on the west coast, then Madras, 1640, Bombay, 1668, and Calcutta, 1690. Real control, however, remained limited to ports, warehouses, and deals with local rulers. India at that time was ruled by the Mughal Empire, one of the largest and most sophisticated Asian powers of the period. Founded in 1526 by Babur, a descendant of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, the Mughal Empire was vast, multicultural, and immensely wealthy. Emperors such as Akbar, Shah Jahan, builder of the Taj Mahal, and Aurangzeb ruled with pomp and military might, but also by negotiation and, for part of the era, religious tolerance. The English pragmatic traders quickly learned that the key was not to conquer the Mughals but to negotiate with them. During the 17th century, the company behaved like any privileged merchant. It paid tributes, struck agreements, secured farmans, imperial permits, and maintained a network of merchant diplomats at Mughal courts. Behind the polite commerce, however, the company was preparing its leap. The turning point came in the 18th century when the Mughal Empire began to unravel. After Aurangzeb's death in 1707, internal strife, regional rebellions, Maratha Muslim wars, and mounting political fragmentation created a power vacuum. This was the moment the company had awaited. By then, the company already fielded its own troops, commanded by British officers and composed of native soldiers called sepoys. In 1757, the company's man in Bengal, Robert Clive, led British forces against the local ruler at the Battle of Plassey. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had seized a British post and allied with the French, company rivals. Through bribes, promises, and modern artillery, Clive won a decisive victory. He not only defeated the Nawab, but installed a puppet and took fiscal and military control of India's richest province. At that point, the company ceased to be merely a business. It became a government, collecting taxes, maintaining regular armies, meddling in successions, suppressing rebellions, and expanding its territory deliberately. Between 1760 and 1800, its domains grew dramatically, turning into a de facto commercial empire. Profits were immense. Wealth extracted from Bengal, silks, cotton, rice, opium, fed London and underpinned part of the Industrial Revolution. By 1770, the company was collecting more tax in India than the British government itself did in England. Yet not everything was efficiency and order. Company rule was also marked by brutal exploitation and humanitarian catastrophe. The starkest example was the Bengal famine of 1770, which killed more than 10 million people, about a third of the local population. The company kept demanding taxes even as crops failed. Human suffering contrasted with the rising dividends of British shareholders who never set foot in India. This imbalance provoked backlash. In Britain, intellectuals, journalists, and MPs began to criticize the company's excessive power. Clive himself was probed for corruption, and Parliament passed laws to oversee company actions. In 1784, Prime Minister William Pitt's India Act created a board of control, placing the company under government supervision. Even so, company dominance lasted more than half a century longer. Formal British administration would assume control only after the Sepoy Revolt of 1857, when native soldiers rose against cultural and religious impositions. The suppression was harsh, and the rebellion served as a pretext for the British Crown to dissolve the company in 1858 and assume direct rule, inaugurating the Raj. But it was the East India Company that laid the foundations. Its corporate logic, military pragmatism, and knack for adapting to local contexts, now negotiating, now imposing, made it the greatest multinational of the pre-industrial age and turned India into the brightest jewel of the British Empire. India was not conquered by crusades or civilizing banners. It was swallowed slowly through treaties, frauds, alliances, and gunpowder by the cold logic of profit and the bureaucracy of a company. And that is what made British domination both so deep and so enduring. Colonization of America and the Sugar Century. When England began to look across the Atlantic, the Spanish and Portuguese had already established themselves as masters of ocean routes and colonial trade. Maps were peppered with Hispanic and Lusitanian names from Brazil to the Philippines, from Mexico to Goa. The Treaty of Tordesillas, though England never recognized it, had created a symbolic division of the world that seemed unbreachable. Yet the geography of power was about to change. England, which until then had acted more as an interloper than as a colonizing power, decided it was time to put down roots in the Americas. It was no longer enough to raid ports or attack ships. It was necessary to occupy, to produce, to enrich, and, if possible, to rival. The start was hesitant. The first late 16th century colonizing attempts, such as Roanoke, vanished mysteriously. But in 1607, with the founding of Jamestown in present-day Virginia, a colonial experiment took shape that would define the future not only of the British Empire, but of the Western world. This colony did not arise from a state project, but from a private company, the Virginia Company, authorized by the Crown to exploit and administer territory in the King's name. Jamestown was, above all, a commercial gamble. The settlers sought gold but found disease, conflict with indigenous peoples, and nearly unlivable conditions. Half the first colonists died in the first winter. Even so, the colony endured. Jamestown's survival was not a glorious feat, but a sign that England had crossed a point of no return. From then on, English presence in the Americas would be continuous, expanding, and profoundly transformative. The following decades saw colonies multiply along the Atlantic coast: Plymouth, founded by Puritans in 1620, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and later colonies taken by force, such as New York, seized from the Dutch. In all, the celebrated 13 English colonies of North America formed, each with its own identity, economic structure, and social makeup. In the north, family settlements, tight-knit religious communities, and maritime commerce prevailed. In the south, large plantations and enslaved labor produced a more hierarchical, aristocratic society geared to export. Yet all these colonies shared something: a growing sense of autonomy fueled by distance from the metropolis and by a local tradition of self-government, regional assemblies, and legal institutions adapted to colonial life. This autonomy, tolerated by England for a long time, would become a seed of rebellion. But before conflict would come, there was wealth to be extracted, and the most valuable, the sweetest, and most violent was sugar. At the beginning of the 17th century, sugar was still a luxury in Europe. The Portuguese had begun large-scale production in Brazil, and their brutal colonial experience served as a model for other powers. England, after seizing Caribbean islands such as Barbados in 1627 and Jamaica in 1655, entered the game for good. Fertile soil, tropical climate, and Atlantic logistics turned these islands into true colonial factories. And in those factories, sugar justified everything. Sugar production was anything but simple. It required vast plantations, mills, boiling, houses, transport, and workers. It demanded capital, control, and discipline, and England plunged into this system completely. The model was simple and cruel. Africans captured on the West African coast were transported on British ships, a journey known as the Middle Passage, the leg between African captivity and American servitude. Conditions in the holds of slaves, ships were inhuman. Bodies in chains, disease, hunger, despair. Thousands died before ever reaching land. Those who survived were sold as property on plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and other British islands. They labored to exhaustion, denied family, land, and freedom. Their working life counted in a handful of years, their deaths tallied as a cost of production. Slavery was part of a larger gearwork, the so-called triangular trade. Ships left, England laden with cloth, arms, tools, and alcohol. These goods were exchanged for captives in Africa. The captives were taken to the Americas, sold, and the money used to purchase sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton, which returned to Europe, enriching ports like Liverpool, Bristol, and London. Sugar fed not only aristocratic tables, but also industries, distilleries, refineries, bakeries. It was a status symbol and an engine of the global economy. Throughout the 18th century, the wealth generated by sugar made the British Caribbean the empire's economic centre of gravity. Though territorially small, the island colonies produced colossal profits. An acre of land in Barbados could be worth more than an entire farm in Virginia. Caribbean planters formed a powerful elite, influential in the British Parliament, with a voice in imperial decisions. Sugar was not merely a product, it was a pillar of the empire. Meanwhile, as the Caribbean prospered on African blood, the North American colonies followed their own path. With a growing population of free settlers, a diversified economy, a blossoming literary culture, and a strong sense of identity, these colonies saw themselves less as extensions of England and more as autonomous societies. In the 18th century, this political distance began to cause friction. After the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763, England faced enormous debt and decided the colonies should pay part of the cost of imperial defence. New tax laws were imposed: the Sugar Act, 1764, the Stamp Act, 1765, the Townshend Acts, 1767. For the colonists, it was not just about money, it was a matter of principle. They had no representatives in Parliament and thus rejected taxes without representation. The phrase, "no taxation without representation," became a rallying cry. The colonial response was swift and coordinated: boycotts, assemblies, pamphlets, newspapers, protests. Tension rose with the Boston Massacre, 1770, and the Boston Tea Party, 1773, when colonists dressed as indigenous people dumped tons of British tea into the harbour to protest the East India Company's monopoly. Repression was harsh. The Intolerable Acts, 1774, closed Boston's port and suspended self-government rights. Trust between colony and metropolis broke down. By 1775, war was inevitable. In 1776, the breach was formalized with the United States. Declaration of Independence. The loss of North America shocked the British Empire. For the first time, a significant part of the empire not only rebelled, but won. The independence of the 13 colonies meant more than a territorial loss. It was an identity crisis. It showed that the empire was not invincible and that its own subjects, raised within the British system, could turn against it in the name of liberty, self-government, and natural rights. Even so, the loss did not destroy the empire. On the contrary, it forced reorganization. From the 1780s onward, England redoubled efforts in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. India, already falling under East India Company domination, became the new focus of expansion. Colonization of Australia accelerated. Slavery, though increasingly questioned, continued to sustain plantations for another half-century. And sugar, always sugar, kept its place at the empire's heart until formal abolition in 1833, and even after, with indentured labourers working in near-servile conditions. The colonization of America and the sugar cycle revealed the two faces of the British Empire: transformative ambition and structural brutality. They also show how the empire was simultaneously a force of global economic integration and a system of racial, social, and cultural domination. America taught England it could export not only goods, but also models of society, yet also that those societies might one day rebel, declare independence, and build a new kind of empire as the United States would become a competing power in the next century. Slavery and the Invisible Empire. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the British Empire expanded its territories and profits beyond Europe, linking continents through maritime routes and trade networks that would profoundly reshape the global economy. At the heart of this system was an element both invisible within imperial structures and omnipresent in its profits: slavery. Slavery wasn't an isolated anomaly, it was a foundational component of the colonial expansion project. It was systematic, regulated, taxed, and fully integrated into the empire's financial machinery. Through it, one of the most powerful engines of the British Atlantic economy was forged. Though the British entered the slave trade later than the Portuguese and Spanish, they quickly caught up in speed and scale. At the start of the 17th century, England was still a secondary naval power, but as it established profitable colonies in the Caribbean, such as Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and St. Kitts, it became clear that their economic viability depended on a continuous supply of labor to sustain large-scale sugar production. Sugar cultivation demanded intensive labor, and there was no available workforce in England to meet the need. The system of indentured servitude, which relied on poor English peasants, proved quickly inadequate. The solution was to import labor from across the Atlantic, people who had been captured or sold along the West African coast. England's official entry into the slave trade came with the founding of the Royal African Company in 1672 under King Charles II. The company was granted a royal charter giving it a monopoly over British trade with Africa. British ships departed from ports like Bristol and Liverpool carrying manufactured goods, textiles, firearms, tools, which were exchanged for human beings at fortified trading posts along the African coast. These enslaved Africans were then transported across the Atlantic via the infamous Middle Passage and disembarked at British plantations in the Caribbean and South America. Ships returned to the UK with holds full of sugar, tobacco, cotton, or rum, completing what became known as the Atlantic Triangular Trade. The transport was highly organized. It's estimated that the British transported around 3.1 million enslaved Africans over their centuries of involvement in the trade. Of these, about 400,000 were taken directly to British colonies, with the remainder distributed via secondary markets to Spanish, French, and Dutch colonies. The human toll was immense. Mortality rates on the voyages ranged from 10% to 20%, with disease, starvation, abuse, and suicide all common. The horrific conditions in ship holds were well documented by sailors, doctors, and missionaries. Yet the system continued with mechanical precision. On plantations, enslaved Africans were treated as property. Their names, languages, and cultural practices were erased. They were recorded in ledgers alongside livestock, tools, or bales of sugar. They labored under extreme heat, armed surveillance, and the constant threat of physical punishment. Local laws codified their status as property. In Barbados, the 1661 Slave Code laid out the legal framework that set Africans apart from all other social groups. They couldn't testify in court, marry legally, own property, or educate their children without a master's permission. Similar laws were enacted in Jamaica, Antigua, and other British islands. Slavery was, in many respects, more institutionalized in the colonies than in Britain itself. Yet its economic effects were deeply felt in the imperial core. Profits from sugar and related activities, plantation financing, marine insurance, shipping, exports, refining, helped fund the banks that would later underpin the Industrial Revolution. Wealthy, aristocratic, and merchant families invested in Caribbean land and lived off the passive income generated by slavery. In London, refined sugar was sold in neighborhood shops, while stocks in colonial companies were traded on the exchange. There was no clear separation between colonial slavery and daily life in England. The connection was constant, though rarely acknowledged. In Africa, the impact was just as deep. Local kingdoms like Dahomey, Benin, and Ashanti became integral to the Atlantic system as suppliers of enslaved people, trading them for firearms, gunpowder, alcohol, and European consumer goods. Ports such as Elmina, Ouidah, and Bonny became major centers of human commerce. The capture of slaves, often driven by internal wars encouraged by European presence, fueled ongoing cycles of violence. This wasn't merely a transatlantic transaction. It was a structure of mutual dependency between European colonial agents and local African elites. Beyond the Caribbean, British colonies on the American mainland also relied on enslaved labor. In the Carolinas, rice became a lucrative crop powered by African labor. In Virginia and Maryland, the same held true for tobacco. Even in the North, where slavery was less prevalent, cities like Boston and New York profited from the trade and insurance of slave ships. Liverpool's port became one of the busiest hubs in the trade, with dozens of ships sailing annually to Africa. Slavery also shaped social and racial dynamics in the colonies. The distinction between free whites and enslaved blacks became normalized over time, with the legal and cultural construction of race used to justify inequality. Religious, linguistic, and ethnic differences among Africans were deliberately erased, creating a generic, subordinated social group. The concept of black as a social identity tied to slavery emerged directly from this process. Skin color became a marker of legal and social status. Enslaved Africans were not passive victims. There were revolts, escapes, everyday resistance, and the formation of runaway communities, such as maroon settlements, deep in the countryside. In British colonies like Jamaica, organized uprisings occurred, such as Tacky's Rebellion in 1760. These revolts were brutally suppressed but required constant military reinforcement. The security of slave colonies ultimately depended on force, demanding troops, surveillance, and ongoing expenses. By the late 18th century, systematic criticism of slavery began to emerge within England itself. Religious groups, especially Quakers, denounced slavery as morally reprehensible. Freed slaves like Olaudah Equiano published widely circulated autobiographies. The abolitionist movement gained momentum with figures like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Granville Sharp. Public mobilization included petitions, boycotts of slave-produced sugar, and parliamentary campaigns. In 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slave Trade Act, abolishing the Atlantic slave trade within the empire. Slavery itself, however, remained legal until 1833. Even after legal abolition, the legacy of slavery remained deeply embedded in the colonial structure. Freed individuals received neither land nor compensation. Instead, former slave owners were reimbursed for the loss of their labor force with massive payouts from the British Treasury, some of which were still being paid into the 21st century. In the colonies, a new system of coerced labor emerged using indentured workers from India and China, who, though technically free, often lived under conditions similar to those of slavery. Slavery in the British Empire was not a peripheral or incidental practice. It was a central pillar of the Atlantic economy, a tool of colonial expansion, a unifying force among imperial elites, and a mechanism connecting tropical plantations to the financial heart of London. It operated through ledgers, notarial contracts, insurance policies, stocks, and royal charters. It was defended in parliaments and discussed in chambers of commerce. It endured for centuries with bureaucratic stability and economic adaptability. It linked African villages, English ports, Caribbean islands, and colonial cities in a global network of production and profit. And in every link of that network, there were names, bodies, journeys, and silences, elements that made slavery not just a practice of its time, but a long-lasting structure that profoundly shaped the empire during its formative and expansive phases. The First Global War, the 7 Years' War, 1756-1763. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire was beginning to take shape, but its reach and influence still trailed that of other European powers, especially France and Spain. Britain had footholds in North America, strong commercial posts in India, a growing presence in the Caribbean, and a powerful navy. But what it lacked was full dominance. That would come only after a conflict of unprecedented scale and consequence. The 7 Years' War. The war began in 1756, but its roots stretched back decades. Tensions between Britain and France had been growing, particularly in North America, where both empires laid claim to vast, overlapping territories. In the Ohio Valley, British settlers pushed westward, challenging French forts and trade routes. The French, allied with various Native American groups, viewed these movements as direct threats. Skirmishes turned into battles, and in 1754, a young George Washington led a failed expedition against French forces at Fort Duquesne, early spark in what would become a global conflagration. While the war's official start in Europe came with Prussia's attack on Saxony, the broader struggle was far more than a continental war. It was a war for empire, a struggle for trade routes, colonies, sea lanes, and economic supremacy. It would come to involve every major European power and be fought across 5 continents. For Britain, it would be a turning point. In Europe, Britain and its ally Prussia faced France, Austria, Russia, and Spain. But the European theatre, while intense, was not where the war would be decided for the British. Their eyes were set firmly on the world beyond, on North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and, most decisively, India. In North America, the war was known as the French and Indian War. British forces, colonial militias, and Native American allies engaged in a long and grueling campaign to push the French from their strongholds. Key battles, such as the capture of Louisbourg in 1758 and the fall of Quebec in 1759, after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, proved decisive. The British Navy enabled swift troop movements and cut off French resupply lines. By 1760, British forces had taken Montreal, effectively ending French control in Canada. In the Caribbean, the war was as much about sugar as it was about strategy. French colonies like Guadeloupe and Martinique were immensely profitable, and British forces launched expeditions to seize them. Guadeloupe fell in 1759 and became a major bargaining chip in post-war negotiations. Sugar, already a lucrative commodity, had become a cornerstone of the imperial economy, and whoever controlled the Caribbean controlled a major share of global wealth. In West Africa, British and French forces clashed over forts and trading posts essential to the transatlantic slave trade. Control of coastal outposts meant control of supply lines to the Americas and, by extension, control over a crucial component of the imperial economy. While less dramatic than campaigns elsewhere, these skirmishes reinforced the global scale of the war. But perhaps the most transformative theatre was India. For years, the British and French East India Companies had competed in trade, diplomacy, and military skirmishes across the subcontinent. The death of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707 had left the empire fragmented, creating opportunities for European intervention. The French had established strong ties in the south, especially in Pondicherry, while the British held key positions in Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. In 1757, 2 years before the official outbreak of war in Europe, the British East India Company, under the command of Robert Clive, secured a decisive victory at the Battle of Plassey. Clive, with a small force of British troops and sepoys, Indian soldiers under British command, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies. Through a combination of military tactics and political manipulation, including bribes and betrayal, Clive seized control of Bengal, one of the wealthiest provinces in India. Plassey was not just a military triumph, it was a pivot in imperial governance. The East India Company gained the right to collect taxes in Bengal, effectively becoming a governing power. This moment marked the beginning of formal British dominance in India and would have enormous consequences for the future of the empire. From that point on, the company acted increasingly as a sovereign authority, blending commerce with administration and military control. By 1763, after nearly a decade of conflict, the war came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The terms of the treaty redrew the global map. France ceded Canada and all its territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. Spain, which had joined the war in support of France, handed over Florida. In exchange, France retained Guadeloupe and Martinique, opting to keep its sugar colonies rather than its Canadian territories, a choice that spoke volumes about the economic logic of empire at the time. In India, the treaty recognized British supremacy in Bengal and other regions, effectively pushing the French out of serious contention. Although the French retained a few trading posts, they were barred from maintaining military forces in the subcontinent. Britain's ascendancy in India was now unchallenged. The war had cost Britain over 160 million, an astronomical sum, but the territorial and commercial gains were immense. The empire had expanded on every front, gaining access to new markets, resources and strategic ports. The Royal Navy had proven itself unmatched in global reach. Britain had become, for the first time, a truly global imperial power. But the victory came with consequences. The cost of the war left Britain with a massive national debt, and the government sought to raise revenues by taxing its American colonies. These new policies, such as the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, would soon generate deep resentment across the Atlantic. The colonists, who had fought alongside British soldiers and believed they had secured new rights as contributors to the imperial victory, were now asked to pay the bill. Within a decade, the empire would face a rebellion from the very territories it had just secured. In many ways, the 7 Years' War was the prototype of modern global conflict. It was fought by professional armies, financed through national debts and directed by long-distance communication and centralized bureaucracies. It tested not only military strength but the capacity to govern, tax, and organize across vast distances. It revealed the strategic importance of naval power, the role of private companies in empire building, and the fluidity of alliances in an age of constant competition. It also revealed the sheer interconnectivity of the British Empire. Event in India shaped negotiations in Paris. Victories in North America altered tax policy in London. Decisions made in Caribbean plantations affected the fate of African trading posts. For the first time, British power operated across multiple theatres simultaneously, not merely as a collection of colonial outposts, but as a coordinated imperial machine. The 7 Years' War was not the beginning of the British Empire, but it was its turning point. From this moment forward, Britain would no longer be a secondary actor in global affairs. It would wield influence over seas and continents, dominate key trade routes, and claim territories with lasting consequences. The war had redrawn borders, but more importantly, it had reshaped ambitions. The American Revolution, 1776-1783. In 1763, the British Empire stood victorious. The 7 Years' War had ended with Britain emerging as the dominant global power, having gained vast new territories in North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, and India. Yet, even as Britain celebrated the height of its imperial reach, its relationship with its American colonies, those very provinces that had fought alongside British forces, was beginning to unravel. What followed over the next 2 decades would reshape the empire, introduce a new kind of revolution, and present a challenge that Britain had not anticipated, that of its own subjects demanding independence. The causes of the American Revolution were not sudden, nor were they purely ideological. From the outset, they were rooted in a combination of financial strain, political missteps, and long-standing tensions between colonial autonomy and metropolitan control. The war had left Britain with a staggering national debt, and Parliament believed that the American colonies, direct beneficiaries of military protection, should contribute to the cost of their own defense and administration. From the perspective of British policymakers, this was reasonable. from the viewpoint of many colonists, it was not. The colonies had grown used to a degree of self-governance. Many had elected assemblies, controlled local taxation, and enforced laws with little interference from London. Over time, a unique colonial political culture had developed, blending British legal traditions with a deep-rooted suspicion of centralised authority. The British Constitution, as interpreted by colonists, guaranteed the rights of Englishmen, chief among them being the right to representation in any legislature that levied taxes. The cry of no taxation without representation was not initially a call for independence, but a protest against what colonists perceived as unconstitutional governance. The first major flashpoint came with the Stamp Act of 1765. This legislation required that printed materials in the colonies carry an official tax stamp, affecting everyone from newspaper publishers to legal clerks and ordinary citizens. The backlash was immediate and widespread. Colonists organized protests, boycotts, and created groups like the Sons of Liberty, which used public pressure and occasionally violence to resist enforcement. Under pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but in doing so issued the Declaratory Act, reaffirming its authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The ideological groundwork was being laid for a much deeper confrontation. Further taxes followed, notably the Townshend Acts in 1767, which imposed duties on imports like glass, paper, paint, and tea. These acts reignited protest across the colonies, particularly in port cities like Boston. Tensions escalated in 1770 when British soldiers opened fire on a group of civilians during a confrontation in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Though only a few people died, the incident was seized upon by colonial propagandists as evidence of British tyranny and brutality. The cycle of provocation and retaliation continued. In 1773, the Tea Act allowed the British East India Company, struggling financially despite its massive reach, to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting colonial merchants. Though the tax on tea had been reduced, the act was seen by many as a dangerous precedent, taxation disguised as commercial regulation. In Boston, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbour. This dramatic gesture, known as the Boston Tea Party, provoked outrage in Britain and a swift, punitive response. Parliament enacted the coercive acts called the Intolerable Acts in the colonies, which closed Boston Harbour, revoked Massachusetts' colonial charter, and allowed British officials accused of crimes in the colonies to be tried in England. Far from quelling unrest, these measures solidified opposition. Other colonies, even those that had not shared Boston's radicalism, viewed the Crown's actions as a threat to liberties everywhere. The First Continental Congress convened in 1774 in Philadelphia, bringing together delegates from 12 colonies to coordinate a collective response. Though still loyal to the king, they issued petitions and agreed to boycott British goods. As diplomacy faltered, violence erupted. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Concord, Massachusetts, to seize weapons stockpiled by colonial militias. They were met by local fighters at Lexington, where the first shots were fired. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of armed conflict. Within weeks, militias laid siege to British-held Boston. The Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775 and appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Still, many delegates hoped for reconciliation. The Olive Branch petition was sent to King George III, affirming loyalty and asking him to intervene against Parliament. The king refused, declaring the colonies to be in open rebellion. By early 1776, the momentum shifted decisively toward independence. The publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense crystallized the argument for a complete break from monarchy and stirred popular sentiment. In July, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson. The document articulated Enlightenment ideals, natural rights, consent of the governed, and the right to revolt against tyranny. But it also served as a political act, formally severing ties with Britain and declaring the colonies a new nation. The war that followed was neither short nor straightforward. The British military was the most powerful in the world. It had a large navy, a well-trained army, and the resources of a global empire. The Americans, by contrast, lacked a standing army, had no navy at first, and were deeply divided internally. Many colonists, known as loyalists, remained faithful to the crown. Yet the patriots, as the revolutionaries called themselves, possessed advantages of their own: familiarity with the terrain, shorter supply lines, local support, and a cause that many found morally compelling. Early in the war, the British strategy focused on quickly capturing key cities and dismantling rebel leadership. They seized New York in 1776 and used it as a base of operations, but they underestimated the difficulty of subduing an insurgent population across a vast and decentralized territory. Washington's leadership proved crucial. Though he suffered defeats, he managed to keep the army intact, scoring morale-boosting victories at Trenton and Princeton in late 1776. In 1777, the British attempted to cut off New England by advancing south from Canada, but their forces were defeated at the Battle of Saratoga. This American victory was decisive not only militarily, but diplomatically. Saratoga convinced France to enter the war on the side of the Americans. In 1778, the Franco-American alliance was formalized, bringing with it military aid, supplies, and eventually troops and naval support. Spain and the Dutch Republic would also join the conflict against Britain, turning what had begun as a colonial rebellion into a global war. British forces now had to defend their empire not just in America, but in the Caribbean, West Africa, the Mediterranean, and even India. The strategic calculus changed dramatically. The final phase of the war shifted to the southern colonies. British commanders believed that loyalist sentiment was stronger in the south and hoped to rally support while cutting off supply lines to the north. They captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780. But guerrilla resistance, coordinated campaigns by American generals like Nathanael Greene, and the persistence of Washington's main army slowly wore down British momentum. In 1781, British General Cornwallis established a defensive position at Yorktown, Virginia, expecting naval support from the British fleet. Instead, the French Navy blocked escape by sea, while Washington and French forces encircled the town by land. After several weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781. Though sporadic fighting continued, Yorktown marked the effective end of the war. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States and ceded territory from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. The war was over, but the effects of the revolution were only beginning to unfold. For Britain, the loss of the American colonies was unprecedented. No other European power had ever seen such a large and prosperous set of colonies break away and form a republic. It challenged assumptions about sovereignty, loyalty, and the very nature of empire. In practical terms, the defeat forced Britain to reconsider its global priorities. If the American colonies were lost, attention turned more fully toward India, the Caribbean, and other parts of the empire where revenue and influence could still be expanded. For the empire itself, the American Revolution became both a cautionary tale and a point of transition. It revealed the limits of coercion, the volatility of settler colonialism, and the power of political identity. The revolution also underscored the growing entanglement between imperial governance and domestic politics. The debates in Parliament, The public campaigns in Britain, the media coverage, all reflected an empire that was no longer merely a projection of power overseas, but a contested political community. The Americans had not merely rejected British rule, they had redefined what governance could mean. Their ideas and example would echo in revolutions to come in France, in Haiti, and in Latin America. But within Britain itself, the Pax Britannica and the Imperial century. In the decades following the American Revolution, Britain faced the challenge of redefining its global position. The loss of the 13 colonies in North America had struck a blow to the structure of empire as it had existed during the 18th century, but the defeat coincided with a broader realignment in European and global affairs. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, and the wars that followed, disrupted every traditional power structure in Europe. Britain, engaged in nearly continuous conflict with revolutionary and then Napoleonic France from 1793 to 1815, found itself once again embroiled in a global war, not of colonies, but of ideologies, alliances, and imperial survival. The Napoleonic Wars had lasting consequences. France, Britain's primary European rival, was decisively defeated. At the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Britain emerged not only as a victor, but as the dominant naval and colonial power of the age. The empire was not yet at its territorial height, but the foundations of a new phase were set, an era in which Britain would wield global influence more extensively than any other power. The term Pax Britannica came to describe the period, from 1815 to roughly 1914, during which Britain, backed by the unrivaled strength of its navy, acted as a global stabilizing force, at least from the perspective of international trade and European diplomacy. This peace was not universal or without conflict, but it was characterized by Britain's growing ability to project power and influence without necessarily resorting to major wars. The empire expanded during this period not just through military conquest, but through treaties, annexations, commercial dominance, and the steady layering of administrative control. One of the defining features of this century was the increasing centralization of imperial governance. The British government, especially after the formal dissolution of the East India Company following the 1857 uprising in India, began to take direct control of colonial administration in large parts of the empire. This was also the period in which the imperial civil service emerged as a professional bureaucracy, with elite officials appointed to manage distant territories under frameworks that often combined local laws with British legal and political principles. India remained the cornerstone of this imperial structure. The East India Company had governed vast territories on the subcontinent since the mid-18th century, but by the mid-19th century, resistance to its rule intensified. The catalyst came in 1857 when a rebellion broke out among Indian soldiers, sepoys, stationed in the company's army. What began as a mutiny over the use of rifle cartridges rumored to be greased with animal fat, offensive to both Hindus and Muslims, quickly escalated into a widespread revolt across northern and central India. British responses were brutal and decisive. After suppressing the rebellion, Parliament enacted the Government of India Act in 1858, ending company rule and transferring sovereignty directly to the Crown. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876. British control now extended not only through military garrisons and administrative centres, but also through a complex system of alliances with Indian princely states, who retained nominal autonomy while pledging loyalty to the British monarch. Elsewhere in Asia, Britain expanded its presence through similar combinations of military assertion and treaty diplomacy. In Southeast Asia, it acquired key positions such as Singapore, founded by Stamford Raffles in 1819 as a strategic entrepot on the route to China. In 1841, Hong Kong was ceded by China following the First Opium War, and further gains followed after the Second Opium War. Britain's involvement in China was rooted not only in the lucrative tea trade, but also in a deepening commitment to the export of British goods and the maintenance of free trade, often enforced by gunboat diplomacy. In addition to formal colonies, the British maintained a sphere of influence in many port cities across East Asia through extraterritorial rights and concessions extracted by treaty. Africa became another arena for imperial engagement, although British interests there evolved more gradually. Initially, the British presence focused on coastal forts and naval patrols to suppress the Atlantic slave trade, which Parliament had abolished in 1807. The Royal Navy began enforcing abolition by intercepting slave ships, particularly along the West African coast. In 1833, slavery was abolished throughout the British Empire, prompting changes in labor systems, especially in the Caribbean. Despite official abolition, the empire sought alternative forms of coerced labor, including indentured workers from Saudi India, who were sent in large numbers to colonies such as Mauritius, Trinidad, and Fiji. British expansion in Africa accelerated in the latter half of the 19th century. In South Africa, conflict with the Boer settlers, descendants of Dutch colonists, developed into a protracted and costly confrontation. Meanwhile, Britain secured control over Egypt in 1882 under the pretext of protecting investment in the Suez Canal, a strategic asset for controlling the route to India. The scramble for Africa toward the end of the century saw Britain claim vast swaths of the continent, often in competition with other European powers. The empire's expansion was not limited to Asia and Africa. In the Pacific, Britain established colonies in Australia and New Zealand. Australia, initially founded as a penal colony in 1788, developed into a settler society with increasing autonomy. New Zealand was annexed more slowly, with the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 formalising British sovereignty. These colonies, alongside Canada, would become key parts of what later evolved into the Dominions, self-governing territories within the empire whose white settler populations were gradually granted full political rights and representation within the imperial framework. These dominions stood in contrast to colonies such as India or those in Africa, where local populations were ruled without such privileges. Throughout the 19th century, the British economy became increasingly integrated. With its imperial holdings, London emerged as the financial capital of the world, and the pound sterling became a dominant currency in international trade. British banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms profited from the movement of goods and capital across the empire. Railways, telegraph cables, and steamships transformed the pace and efficiency of imperial administration and commerce. Infrastructure projects were both tools of control and symbols of modernization, linking interior regions with ports and facilitating the movement of raw materials to British factories. Cotton from India and Egypt, rubber from Malaya, tea from Ceylon, and minerals from southern Africa flowed through imperial trade routes to feed British industry. Manufactured goods, in turn, were exported back to the colonies, creating an interdependent system that enriched Britain and reinforced its global economic dominance. Military power underpinned all of this. The Royal Navy at its peak was larger than the next two navies combined. Its global presence allowed Britain to patrol sea lanes, suppress piracy, enforce treaties, and support commercial interests. Imperial garrisons stationed in colonies ensured that uprisings could be dealt with quickly. The image of the British soldier in a red coat became synonymous with imperial presence, whether in the Punjab, the Sudan, or Hong Kong. At the same time, the British Army increasingly relied on colonial troops, Indian sepoys, African regiments, and Caribbean volunteers who served in conflicts around the empire, often far from their places of origin. The ideological basis of empire also evolved. In addition to economic and strategic rationales, many Britons embraced a sense of moral duty tied to ideas of civilization, progress, and racial hierarchy. The notion of the civilizing mission gained prominence, bolstered by missionary societies, educational reformers, and administrators who believed that British governance would uplift subject peoples through law, order, and Christianity. This rhetoric often served to mask the more pragmatic and exploitative aspects of empire, but it was deeply influential in shaping public perceptions and justifying continued expansion. Schools, churches, railroads, and colonial legal systems were presented not just as instruments of administration, but as symbols of imperial benevolence and cultural superiority. In Parliament, debates about the nature and future of empire became more common. Some politicians championed the virtues of imperial unity and sought to integrate the dominions more tightly with Britain. Others raised concerns about the costs of defending far-flung colonies or the moral implications of ruling over subject peoples. In the press and popular literature, the empire became a subject of fascination and pride. Maps in schoolrooms colored British possessions in red, and adventure novels portrayed distant lands as arenas of heroism and discovery. Exhibitions in cities like London and Manchester displayed colonial products and peoples as evidence of imperial success. The sheer diversity of the empire was one of its most striking features. It encompassed Arctic Canada and Equatorial Africa, Muslim kingdoms in India and Anglican churches in Australia, sugar plantations in the Caribbean, and gold mines in South Africa. Its subjects spoke hundreds of languages and followed countless faiths. Managing this diversity required not only military and administrative tools, but also an evolving understanding of how to govern difference. British rule was often pragmatic and adaptive, balancing direct control with indirect rule, imposing taxes while allowing local elites to maintain status, and tolerating certain customs while outlawing others. The result was an empire of paradoxes. At once flexible and rigid, centralized and fragmented, modern and archaic. The Victorian Empire at its height. By the middle of the 19th century, the British Empire had entered its most confident and expansive phase. The reign of Queen Victoria, beginning in 1837 and lasting until 1901, coincided with what many contemporaries saw as the golden age of British imperialism. During this period, the empire expanded to become the largest the world had ever seen, encompassing a quarter of the Earth's landmass and ruling over nearly a quarter of its population. While the seeds of this dominance had been planted earlier in India, the Caribbean, the Pacific, and parts of Africa, it was in the Victorian era that the scale, infrastructure, ideology, and global visibility of the empire reached their zenith. At home, the empire became deeply embedded in the social and political imagination. Maps colored in imperial red adorned schoolroom walls. Newspapers reported on the actions of British governors and generals in distant lands, and the exploits of explorers, missionaries, and colonial officials became subjects of popular admiration. The monarchy itself was transformed by empire. In 1876, Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India, a symbolic act that tied the legitimacy of the crown to the authority of empire. The sense of Britain's global mission, power, and destiny shaped everything from public education to parliamentary debate. Technological change played a central role in making this expansive empire administratively viable. The rapid development of the steamship, the expansion of telegraph networks, and the construction of global railway systems dramatically shrank the distances between London and the outer provinces. A message that once took months to reach Bombay or Cape Town could now be transmitted in minutes via undersea cables. Steamships moved goods and people with new speed and reliability. Railways were constructed across India, Canada, Australia, and parts of Africa not merely for commerce, but to consolidate imperial authority, move troops swiftly, and demonstrate modernity. These networks were physical expressions of imperial power, linking colony to colony and all to the imperial center. India remained the core of this global structure. After the transfer of authority from the East India Company to the British Crown in 1858, British governance became more direct but also more cautious. The rebellion of 1857 had revealed the limits of military dominance and the dangers of cultural imposition. In the decades that followed, British administrators embraced a more calculated form of rule, governing through princely states, religious leaders, and local elites, while maintaining control over taxation, law, and the army. The Indian civil service became the administrative spine of the colony, filled with officials who had passed competitive exams and often regarded their roles as a form of noble service. Simultaneously, British economic policy reoriented India's agriculture and industry toward imperial needs: cotton for British textile mills, tea for domestic markets, opium for trade with China. The population grew, cities expanded, and so too did tensions over land, famine relief, and political representation. In Africa, the Victorian period saw a dramatic acceleration of imperial expansion. What began as a patchwork of coastal enclaves turned into full territorial claims. British interests in southern Africa were particularly complex. Cape Colony had long been under British control, but tensions with Dutch-descended settlers, the Boers, intensified during the latter half of the century. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley in 1867 and later gold in the Transvaal altered the strategic significance of the region. British capital and labour flowed in, and with it came increasing friction over land, resources, and sovereignty. Conflicts with Zulu kingdoms, the First Boer War, 1880–81, and the escalating pressures of settler colonialism laid the groundwork for a much bloodier confrontation at the century's end. West Africa followed a different trajectory. Initially, British involvement there had focused on trade and the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade. Sierra Leone was founded as a settlement for freed slaves, and British naval patrols in the Atlantic continued to intercept slave ships long after abolition. But as economic interests shifted toward palm oil, cocoa, and rubber, Britain began to assert more formal control. Lagos became a colony in 1861, the Gold Coast expanded under British administration, and treaties were made with local rulers to secure commercial privileges and suppress resistance. In Egypt, Britain's strategic and financial interests became paramount after the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869. Though constructed by the French, the canal was heavily financed by British capital and viewed as the lifeline to India. When Egypt's debt crisis threatened European investments and a nationalist uprising challenged foreign control in the early 1880s, Britain sent troops to occupy the country. Though nominally under Ottoman sovereignty, Egypt became a de facto British protectorate with British officials overseeing finances and foreign policy. Control of the canal gave Britain enormous strategic leverage, allowing it to move goods and military forces between Europe and Asia with unprecedented speed. In Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Victorian Empire spread through both settler, colonies, and commercial interests. Australia and New Zealand, already under British control, moved toward greater self-government, with Australia's colonies forming a federation in 1901. The Pacific Islands were drawn into imperial networks through a mix of treaties, protectorates, and missionary activity. In Southeast Asia, the Strait settlements, Singapore, Penang, and Malacca, became key nodes in British shipping routes, while Malaya was drawn into the imperial orbit through tin and rubber exports. British firms dominated trade in port cities like Rangoon and Bangkok, even in territories not formally colonized. The Caribbean, though no longer the empire's economic centre, remained significant. After the abolition of slavery, many British colonies in the West Indies transitioned to indentured labour, particularly from India. Sugar production continued, but under new conditions. The social fabric of the region was altered by migration, economic contraction, and struggles for political voice among freedmen and indentured workers. Though the grandeur of Caribbean plantations had faded since their 18th century peak, the islands remained tied to British commerce and political identity. Economic theories and ideologies during this era increasingly reflected imperial priorities. Classical economists often described colonies as essential to Britain's prosperity, emphasizing their role as sources of raw materials and markets for manufactured goods. But by the late 19th century, debates intensified. Some advocated for a more tightly bound imperial trade bloc, especially in the face of competition from rising industrial powers like Germany and the United States. Tariff reformers sought to give preferential treatment to colonial goods, while others warned against economic overextension and the dangers of over-reliance on imperial markets. Imperial ideology also matured into a comprehensive worldview. Racial theories developed in Europe during this period were applied to colonial administration. Pseudo-scientific ideas of hierarchy and civilization justified not only the governance of subject peoples but also their exclusion from political power. At the same time, imperial narratives of progress and humanitarianism persisted. Missionary societies expanded, building schools, hospitals, and churches across the empire. British education systems were exported, often teaching English literature and law to colonial elites, while simultaneously reinforcing notions of British cultural superiority. Women played increasingly visible roles in imperial life. British women in the colonies participated in missionary work, education, and healthcare, often becoming key figures in the transmission of imperial values. At home, the empire influenced literature, fashion, philanthropy, and the suffrage movement. Female authors like Flora Shaw and Mary Kingsley wrote travel narratives that brought stories of Africa and Asia to a domestic audience, blending admiration, exoticism, and support for imperial governance. The military campaigns of the Victorian Empire were frequent and varied. From the Indian frontier to Sudan, from Burma to southern Africa, British troops were deployed in campaigns often described as punitive or protective. These wars were frequently asymmetric, disciplined British regiments, supported by artillery and colonial auxiliaries, engaged in operations against loosely organized or numerically inferior indigenous forces. The cost in lives was borne disproportionately by colonial subjects, but the political costs for Britain remained relatively low until the end of the century. Public displays of imperial strength became central to national identity. Queen Victoria's jubilees in 1887 and 1897 were staged as imperial spectacles, with troops, dignitaries, and subjects from across the empire parading in London. Exhibitions in London and other major cities displayed colonial goods, technologies, and even peoples as living exhibits. The empire was celebrated as a source of pride, unity, and prosperity. Its complexity, its conflicts, contradictions, and inequalities was seldom addressed in public discourse. Despite all its scale and seeming stability, the Victorian Empire was never a static structure. It depended on local cooperation, evolving administrative strategies, and constant recalibration of power. Beneath its surface ran currents of dissent, resistance, adaptation, and negotiation. The very expansion that characterized the empire at its height also made it more difficult to manage. It was vast, often decentralized, and increasingly questioned, not just by those it ruled, but by those who ruled in its name. Rebellion and resistance. The British Empire, at its most expansive, was neither universally accepted nor uncontested. Beneath the surface of imperial governance, and often in open defiance of it, ran an undercurrent of rebellion, resistance, and refusal. From military insurrections to religious movements, from peasant revolts to political organizations, resistance to British rule occurred in nearly every region where the empire planted its flag. These challenges took many forms, some coordinated and ideologically driven, others spontaneous and local, but all revealed the limits of imperial control and the tensions that accompanied foreign rule. In India, where British authority was most deeply entrenched, the most significant early rebellion erupted in 1857. Known in British accounts as the Indian Mutiny, and in Indian history as the First War of Independence, it began among sepoys, Indian soldiers employed by the British East India Company who objected to new rifle cartridges rumoured to be greased with cow and pig fat, substances offensive to Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities. The rebellion quickly spread beyond the military ranks, engulfing cities like Delhi, Kanpur, and Lucknow, where discontent had been building due to land annexations, economic disruptions, and religious interference. For months, British authority in northern India was severely challenged. The eventual suppression of the rebellion led to widespread reprisals, the dissolution of the East India Company, and the formal incorporation of India into the British Crown. Yet the memory of the uprising endured, shaping both British policy and Indian nationalism in the decades that followed. In the Caribbean, resistance had earlier emerged in the form of slave uprisings. Enslaved Africans and their descendants staged repeated revolts in British colonies during the 18th and early 19th centuries. In Jamaica, the 1760 Tackies War and the massive 1831 Baptist War, led by Samuel Sharp, demonstrated the extent to which enslaved populations could organize and coordinate resistance. Though brutally suppressed, the 1831 revolt had far-reaching consequences. Coming just 2 years before the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, it helped to convince some in Britain that the institution of slavery could not be maintained without continuous violence. After emancipation, unrest continued in response to labor exploitation and political exclusion. In 1865, the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, led by Paul Bogle, emerged from grievances over land, wages, and judicial discrimination. British authorities declared martial law, executed hundreds, and tightened colonial control, yet the event again exposed the volatility of post-emancipation societies. In southern Africa, conflict was chronic and multifaceted. The British presence clashed with both indigenous kingdoms and settler populations. The Zulu kingdom, under leaders like Shaka and later Cetshwayo, offered significant resistance to colonial encroachment. In 1879, the Anglo-Zulu War broke out, after the British demanded the disbandment of the Zulu military system. The British suffered a notable defeat at the Battle of Isandlwana before regrouping and defeating the Zulu forces. Meanwhile, tensions with Boer settlers, descendants of the Dutch colonists, led to multiple conflicts. The First Boer War, 1880–1881, resulted in a British defeat and a temporary restoration of Boer independence. 2 decades later, the Second Boer War, 1899–1902, fought over control of mineral-rich territories, became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the empire. The British eventually prevailed, but only after a costly campaign involving scorched earth tactics and the use of concentration camps. In West Africa, opposition to British expansion emerged in various forms. In the Gold Coast, the Ashanti Empire resisted British incursions over the course of several decades. The series of Anglo-Ashanti Wars, beginning in 1824 and culminating in 1900, reflected the determination of Ashanti rulers to preserve their sovereignty. The final conflict erupted after British officials demanded the Golden Stool a sacred symbol of Ashanti kingship. The Ashanti mobilized quickly, attacking British forts and besieging the colonial capital of Kumasi. Though eventually subdued, the campaign highlighted both the symbolic and political dimensions of colonial resistance. Elsewhere in Nigeria, leaders such as Jaja of Opobo and Nana Olomu challenged British trade restrictions and territorial advances, often blending diplomacy with military resistance before being forcibly removed or exiled. In Sudan, one of the most dramatic challenges to British and Egyptian rule came with the Mahdist Revolt of 1881. Led by Muhammad Ahmad, who declared himself the Mahdi, a messianic figure in Islamic tradition, the movement aimed to purify Islam and expel foreigner influence. The Mahdist forces rapidly gained control of much of Sudan, capturing Khartoum in 1885 and killing General Charles Gordon, a moment that reverberated in British public consciousness. It would take years and a large-scale Anglo-Egyptian military campaign before Sudan was reconquered in 1898 at the Battle of Omdurman. The revolt had mobilized thousands and created a rival state, demonstrating that even in militarized regions, resistance could take on both religious and nationalist overtones. In the Middle East, Britain's increasing involvement led to periodic uprisings. In Egypt, the 1881 revolt led by Colonel Ahmed Urabi, known as the Urabi Revolt, sought constitutional reforms and an end to foreign control. Though initially supported by segments of the military and the general population, the movement was crushed after British intervention and the occupation of Egypt in 1882. While nominally under Ottoman sovereignty, Egypt became effectively controlled by Britain, with Cairo administered by British advisors for decades. Discontent simmered and nationalist sentiment grew steadily into the 20th century. In Southeast Asia, colonial expansion also met resistance. In Burma, the annexation of territory proceeded in phases, each met with armed opposition. The final Anglo-Burmese War in 1885 resulted in the incorporation of Upper Burma into British India, but guerrilla resistance persisted for years afterward. Local rulers, monks and village militias mounted irregular campaigns that challenged British authority, requiring a heavy military presence and continuous suppression. Elsewhere in the Pacific and Australasia, where settler colonies dominated, resistance took a different shape. In New Zealand, the Maori resisted British land seizures and political marginalisation through a series of conflicts known as the New Zealand Wars, 1845–1872. These wars combined conventional engagements with guerrilla tactics and were rooted in both land disputes and deeper questions of sovereignty. Though the British military eventually prevailed, Maori resistance endured in various forms, including legal action and political organisation. In Australia, Aboriginal resistance was largely localised and often went unrecorded, but it was widespread. Dispossession, disease, and violent confrontation accompanied settler expansion, and Aboriginal groups resisted with whatever means were available: ambushes, withdrawal, and cultural endurance. Throughout the empire, resistance also took non-violent forms. In India, the late 19th century saw the emergence of political organizations such as the Indian National Congress, founded in 1885. Initially composed of Western-educated elites who sought greater representation within the imperial system, the Congress would eventually become a vehicle for more assertive demands. In British colonies across Africa and the Caribbean, newspapers, petitions, mutual aid societies, and labor unions became channels for expressing discontent and organizing opposition. Religious movements, too, offered a platform for anti-colonial sentiment, blending spiritual renewal with political messaging. Across West Africa, Christian converts began founding independent churches that rejected missionary control and preached self-determination. The British Empire, with its vast reach, encountered an equally vast range of resistance. Some of it was extinguished swiftly, while other movements endured or laid the foundation for later struggles. Across time and geography, opposition to imperial authority revealed the contested nature of the imperial project, its reliance on coercion, and the persistent agency of those it sought to govern. The Age of Reform and the Moral Empire. By the early 19th century, the British Empire had become not only a structure of economic and political power, but also a platform for moral and ideological debate. As its reach extended, questions arose, not just among critics and colonized populations, but within Britain itself, about how power should be exercised and what responsibilities, if any, came with imperial rule. This period witnessed the emergence of what is often referred to as the moral empire, a phase in which imperial expansion and governance were increasingly justified not only by profit or security, but by appeals to civilization, reform, and humanitarian duty. One of the earliest and most powerful impulses in this shift came from the abolitionist movement. Slavery had been fundamental to the British imperial economy, especially in the Caribbean, for more than a century. By the late 18th century, however, a growing coalition of religious groups, reform-minded intellectuals, and working-class organizers had begun to mount a systematic campaign against the institution. Evangelical Anglicans, Quakers, and former enslaved people like Olaudah Equiano presented moral arguments that gained traction in Parliament and among the public. The campaign resulted in the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which abolished the transatlantic slave trade throughout the empire. Enforcement followed with naval patrols on the West African coast and the seizure of slave ships. Then, in 1833, slavery itself was abolished across British colonies with the Slavery Abolition Act, ending the legal ownership of persons. However, abolition did not immediately free the enslaved in practice. Former enslaved individuals in colonies like Jamaica and Barbados were subjected to a so-called apprenticeship system that required them to continue laboring for their former masters for a number of years. This halfway measure, justified as a transitional phase, was seen by many as a way to protect plantation profits rather than human dignity. Resistance to the system led to its eventual termination in 1838. Even then, the economic system that had relied on enslaved labor was quickly replaced by forms of coerced labor, particularly through indentured servitude, most prominently involving workers from India. Large numbers of Indian laborers were transported to plantations in Mauritius, British Guiana, Trinidad, and Fiji, often under contracts they could not read and in conditions little removed from bondage. These systems served the dual purpose of preserving colonial plantation economies while allowing the empire to present itself as having moved beyond slavery. The idea of reform spread beyond labor. Throughout the 19th century, the British Parliament passed a series of laws and regulations designed to reshape the administration of empire. These measures emerged from a variety of impulses: evangelical Christianity, liberal political philosophy, utilitarian ideas of governance and responses to crises like famine or rebellion. In India, especially after the rebellion of 1857, administrators such as Lord Dalhousie and Lord Curzon framed British rule in terms of modernization. Railways, telegraph lines, legal codifications, and English language education were presented, not merely as tools of imperial efficiency but as gifts of progress. The imperial state now claimed a civilizing mission, its task not simply to govern, but to uplift. Missionary activity expanded in parallel. Organizations such as the Church Missionary Society and the London Missionary Society sent clergy, teachers, and doctors across the empire, particularly to Africa and Asia. Their stated goal was the conversion of heathen populations to Christianity, but their activities also brought literacy, medical care, and moral instruction as understood by Victorian norms. Missionaries often challenged local customs, especially those related to marriage, gender roles, and religion. In India, the practice of sati, widow self-immolation, was outlawed in 1829 under Governor-General Lord William Bentinck, with strong backing from British missionaries and social reformers. The ban was used to highlight the moral superiority of British rule, even as debates about cultural imposition versus indigenous autonomy simmered below the surface. In Africa, missionary work intersected with anti-slavery patrols and economic exploration. Figures such as David Livingstone embodied the union of Christian zeal, scientific curiosity, and imperial ambition. Livingstone's expeditions into the interior of the continent aimed not only to map and report, but to open new routes for trade and the spread of Christianity. His descriptions of African societies, often marked by both admiration and condescension, shaped British public opinion and reinforced the belief that the empire had a duty to transform what it encountered. Education became a key tool in the moral empire. Colonial governments and missionary societies established schools in India, West Africa, and the Caribbean, offering instruction in English literature, arithmetic, Christian doctrine, and moral behavior. These schools were designed to create a class of intermediaries, colonial subjects who could assist in administration and governance, while also embodying the values of the imperial center. Graduates of such institutions often occupied an ambiguous position, fluent in the language and norms of empire, yet aware of its contradictions and exclusions. Some became critics of the very system that educated them. The reforming impulse was also visible in the administrative machinery of empire. Commissions were established to investigate colonial corruption, mismanagement, and abuse. The exposure of harsh labor conditions in places like British Guiana and the Niger Delta led to calls for more oversight and better regulation. The Colonial Office, increasingly professionalized, imposed reporting systems, conducted inquiries, and sent out inspectors. Though imperial power remained hierarchical and often coercive, it was now expected to justify itself in terms of justice, efficiency, and moral purpose. This era also saw the expansion of empire justified by the notion of trusteeship. Colonies were increasingly depicted as wards under British care, unable to govern themselves, but capable of improvement under British guidance. This notion positioned imperial rule not as domination, but as stewardship. It was a paternalistic ideology, often cloaked in humanitarian language that enabled expansion while muting critique. It also gave rise to contradictions. While claiming to civilize and protect, the empire frequently exploited labor, expropriated land, and suppressed dissent. The tension between reform and repression was a persistent feature of the moral empire. In India, for instance, legal reforms coexisted with censorship laws and sedition charges. In Africa, humanitarian rhetoric accompanied military campaigns and annexations. In the Caribbean, promises of equality were regularly undercut by racial hierarchies and economic exclusions. Yet within these contradictions lay the shape of future change. Reform created new expectations among colonial subjects, among critics at home, and within the structures of empire itself. The age of high imperialism and rivalry. In the final decades of the 19th century, the British Empire entered a new phase of expansion and consolidation, often described as the era of high imperialism. While the empire had been growing steadily for centuries, it was during the 1880s and 1890s that its territorial gains accelerated most dramatically, particularly in Africa. This period was defined by competition among European powers, advances in military technology, and the intensification of imperial ideologies that framed expansion as both a strategic necessity and a civilizing duty. The British Empire, already vast in scope, now faced new rivals and sought to secure its dominance not only through conquest, but through systems of administration, economic integration, and global communication. The most visible expression of this competitive dynamic was the scramble for Africa, a rapid partitioning of the African continent by European powers beginning in earnest in the 1880s. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy moved to claim territories across the continent, driven by economic ambitions, nationalist pride, and geopolitical calculation. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, European powers established rules for the occupation of African territory, emphasizing that colonial claims had to be backed by effective control on the ground. The result was an intensified rush to establish outposts, treaties, and garrisons, often with little regard for pre-existing African political or cultural boundaries. For Britain, the strategic logic was both global and regional. Control of the Cape to Cairo corridor, stretching from South Africa to Egypt, became a goal associated with figures like Cecil Rhodes, a businessman and imperialist whose vision of a continuous north-south axis under British control symbolized the aspirations of the time. Though the full corridor was never realized, British advances in the region were substantial. In South Africa, control over mineral wealth, especially after the discovery of diamonds and gold, triggered conflicts with both African kingdoms and Boer settlers. The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 and the First Boer War of 1880-81 revealed the complexities of conquest. The defeat at Isandlwana, where a Zulu army overran a British column, stunned observers in London and exposed vulnerabilities in imperial assumptions. British forces eventually prevailed, but not without cost. Further north, Egypt and Sudan became key sites of imperial focus. Britain had occupied Egypt in 1882 under the pretext of restoring order during a nationalist revolt led by Ahmed Arabi, but strategic interest centered on the Suez Canal, which provided a direct maritime route to India. Though Egypt remained nominally under Ottoman suzerainty, British advisors effectively ran its administration. British presence expanded into Sudan, where a rebellion led by Muhammad Ahmad, the Mahdi, had created an independent Islamic state. The Mahdist uprising resulted in the fall of Khartoum in 1885 and the death of General Charles Gordon, whose dramatic last stand became a powerful symbol in the British imagination. A campaign to reconquer Sudan, culminating in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, reasserted British control and introduced new military technologies, including the Maxim gun, which underscored the asymmetrical nature of these imperial conflicts. In West Africa, British expansion proceeded through a mixture of treaties, military campaigns, and commercial pressure. The Gold Coast, modern Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone became important colonial possessions. Local resistance, such as that of the Ashanti Empire, and later leaders like Sultan Atahiru in northern Nigeria, was met with force. Companies such as the Royal Niger Company, which functioned as both a commercial enterprise and a colonial administrator, advanced British interests before territories were brought under direct Crown rule. These arrangements reflected the hybrid nature of imperial expansion, a combination of private initiative and official control. In East Africa, Britain sought to balance its interests against German and French incursions. The British East Africa Protectorate, established in 1895, covered much of what is today Kenya. Railways were built inland from the port of Mombasa, intended to support settler agriculture and assert British control over highland regions. African resistance was frequent. The Nandi resistance, lasting from 1895 to 1905, challenged British encroachment and led to harsh reprisals. Similar dynamics played out in Uganda, where British missionaries and administrators encountered a complex mix of kingdoms and rival religious affiliations. Administrative systems were imposed gradually, with indirect rule relying on local chiefs and newly created hierarchical structures. Beyond Africa, imperial competition extended to Asia. Britain's long-standing dominance in India remained intact, but new attention was directed toward Tibet, Afghanistan, and Persia, regions situated between British India and Russian territories. This competition, often referred to as the Great Game, pitted Britain and Russia against each other in a struggle for influence in Central Asia. British concerns about Russian advances toward India led to several military interventions in Afghanistan, including the Second Anglo-Afghan War, 1878–1880, which resulted in a British-imposed foreign policy arrangement while leaving Afghanistan formally independent. Meanwhile, the partition of China into spheres of influence during the late Qing dynasty drew British attention to the defense of commercial and territorial rights. British control of Hong Kong expanded after the Second Opium War was consolidated, and additional territories were leased in Kowloon and the New Territories. The British also gained concessions in cities like Shanghai and Tianjin, which operated under extraterritoriality, meaning British citizens were subject to British rather than Chinese law. British trade interests in China, particularly in opium, silk and tea, remained critical, even as Chinese resistance grew. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899–1901, a nationalist and anti-foreign uprising, brought British troops alongside other European and Japanese forces into Beijing to suppress the movement and impose further terms on the Chinese court. Elsewhere in the world, Britain continued to assert control over strategic islands and coastal regions. In the Caribbean, though economic importance had declined after the abolition of slavery, the region remained a key naval and coaling network. In the Pacific, British authority extended over Fiji, New Guinea, and islands in Polynesia, often through protectorates or treaties that involved minimal administrative presence but significant symbolic and strategic value. Australia and New Zealand, already settler colonies, advanced toward full dominion status, with Australia federating in 1901. These dominions maintained allegiance to the Crown while exercising increasing legislative independence. The late 19th century also saw growing interest in imperial unity. Figures like Joseph Chamberlain, colonial secretary from 1895, promoted the idea of a more integrated imperial structure based on common defense, shared economic interests, and symbolic allegiance to Britain. Proposals for imperial tariffs and preferential trade sought to bind the empire economically, while conferences among colonial leaders aimed to coordinate policies. Yet this vision met resistance, particularly from colonies that valued their legislative independence. The Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, negotiated a balance between loyalty and autonomy that would shape their later transitions to full sovereignty. The ideological foundations of high imperialism drew from an increasingly racialized understanding of global order. Scientific theories of hierarchy and evolution were applied to societies and cultures, reinforcing ideas of European superiority and the supposed civilizing mission of empire. Schools, exhibitions, missionary activity, and public discourse propagated these views across the imperial core and periphery. The expansion of imperial education systems, the codification of customary law, and the professionalization of the colonial service all contributed to the belief that empire was not only a political and economic project, but also a moral and historical responsibility. Military campaigns continued to punctuate this age of confidence. From expeditions in Somaliland to frontier wars in India, from naval patrols in the South China Sea to anti-slavery operations in East Africa, the empire required constant defense and adjustment. The logistical capabilities of the Royal Navy and the use of colonial troops, Indian sepoys, West African regiments, and Caribbean auxiliaries enabled Britain to project power globally with efficiency. Yet beneath the surface, challenges persisted. resistance movements continued, sometimes quiet, sometimes open, and in many cases, increasingly organized. By the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire appeared unassailable in its extent and influence. Its red swathes across the map signaled control over territory, labor, resources, and capital on an unprecedented scale. The empire functioned not just through coercion, but through institutions, commerce, symbols, and a deeply embedded belief in the legitimacy of its global presence. It stood at the center of international affairs, managing rivalries, balancing treaties, and setting the terms of economic exchange for much of the globe. Between wars, reforms, crises, and shifting power. In the aftermath of the First World War, the British Empire stood at a moment of contradiction. Victorious in conflict and larger than it had ever been, it now encompassed over 13 million square miles and governed more than 450 million people. Yet the very war that had demonstrated the empire's reach and military capability had also generated tensions that proved difficult to contain. Political, social, and economic pressures mounted in the 1920s and 1930s, and the interwar decades became a time of adjustment, reform, resistance, and increasingly visible fractures. The empire's survival now required new strategies: accommodation where possible, repression where necessary, and a growing effort to present imperial rule as modern, rational, and globally relevant in an age of mass politics, economic volatility, and ideological challenge. One of the most immediate post-war responses came in the form of political reform aimed at accommodating demands for greater autonomy within the empire, particularly in India. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, proposed during the war and implemented through the Government of India Act of 1919, expanded the participation of Indians in provincial government through a system of diarchy, while British governors retained control over key areas such as finance and defence. Indian ministers were allowed to oversee departments like education and public health. This arrangement was intended to appease growing nationalist sentiment, but it satisfied few. The Indian National Congress, under new leadership and invigorated by the return of Mohandas Gandhi from South Africa, launched a mass campaign of non-cooperation. Gandhi's strategy of non-violent resistance, based on civil disobedience and the refusal to comply with unjust laws, mobilized millions. Strikes, boycotts of British goods, and refusal to pay taxes became tools of a widening movement. Although the British authorities responded with arrests and bans, the scale of mobilization forced further reassessment of imperial policy. In 1935, a new Government of India Act was passed, creating elected provincial legislatures with wider powers and establishing a federal structure that envisioned greater autonomy for the princely states and British Indian provinces alike. While the Act was the most significant constitutional reform in colonial India to date, it fell short of full self-rule and was rejected by the Congress leadership. Nonetheless, it became the framework for administration through the remainder of British rule, and elections under the Act in 1937 led to Indian majority governments in several provinces. Yet beneath the institutional reforms, political tensions deepened between Hindus and Muslims, between radicals and moderates, and between central authority and regional demands. The framework of British imperial governance in India had shifted, but not decisively enough to meet the growing aspirations for independence. Elsewhere in the empire, the interwar years saw a gradual evolution of the status of the dominions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State increasingly acted as independent actors in global affairs, despite formal allegiance to the Crown. Their participation in the imperial conferences of the 1920s and 1930s led to the articulation of a new relationship through the Balfour Declaration of 1926, which described the dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire equal in status. This formula was codified in the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which granted legal recognition to the legislative independence of the dominions. From this point forward, they could determine their own foreign and domestic policy, although ties to Britain remained through shared monarchic allegiance and informal cultural connection. The process was evolutionary rather than revolutionary, but it marked a redefinition of empire as a network of cooperating polities rather than a centralized structure of command. The political reshaping of the empire coincided with profound economic challenges. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, reverberated through every corner of the imperial system. Global trade collapsed, commodity prices plummeted, and colonial economies, often dependent on single cash crops or raw materials, suffered devastating consequences. In the West Indies, sugar prices fell to historic lows, generating mass unemployment and food shortages. In West Africa, the collapse of cocoa and palm oil exports led to social unrest. In India, falling agricultural prices exacerbated rural indebtedness and deepened the crisis of subsistence among peasants. British colonial policy, which had traditionally emphasized fiscal restraint and balanced budgets, offered little relief. The response often took the form of wage cuts, increased taxation, and intensified control, further alienating colonial populations already disillusioned by political exclusion. To mitigate economic fragmentation, Britain moved toward a system of imperial preference, first proposed at the Ottawa Conference of 1932. This scheme aimed to strengthen trade within the empire by imposing tariffs on foreign goods and granting preferential access to imperial products. The intention was to create an integrated economic bloc that could insulate the empire from global volatility. While imperial preference bolstered some sectors, particularly in the dominions, it had limited effect on colonies lacking diversified economies or infrastructure. Moreover, the growing disparity between rhetoric and reality, between promises of shared prosperity and the harsh conditions in many colonial territories, fueled skepticism about the value of empire for its subjects. The political repercussions of economic crisis were sharpest where political movements had already taken root. In India, the Depression strengthened support for nationalist parties advocating land reform and economic self-sufficiency. In the Caribbean, labor movements gained traction, leading to a series of strikes and protests during the 1930s. The most dramatic occurred in Jamaica and Trinidad in 1937 and 1938, where workers demanded higher wages, union recognition, and political representation. The colonial response combined military suppression with the appointment of commissions to investigate conditions. The resulting reports acknowledged the failures of imperial economic policy and recommended reforms, including expanded education and political participation. Still, substantive changes came slowly, and the perception of empire as indifferent to suffering deepened. In Palestine, where Britain held a League of Nations mandate, tensions between Jewish and Arab communities escalated during the interwar years, complicated by British promises made during World War I and rising levels of Jewish immigration. The Arab Revolt of 1936-1939 posed a direct challenge to British authority and to the policy of maintaining a fragile balance between incompatible nationalist demands. British forces suppressed the revolt with significant force, but the political problem remained unresolved. In Iraq, granted nominal independence in 1932 but still under British influence, repeated tensions revealed the limitations of the new arrangements. In Egypt, too, the interwar period was marked by struggles between a formally independent monarchy, nationalist parties, and a persistent British military and diplomatic presence. The interwar empire also had to contend with the growing ideological challenge posed by rival global models. The rise of communism, following the Russian Revolution, introduced a new vocabulary of anti-imperialism that resonated in many colonial settings. Communist and socialist movements emerged in India, Malaya, the Caribbean, and Africa, often operating underground and linking economic grievances with calls for liberation. British authorities responded with a mix of surveillance, censorship, and repression. Simultaneously, the rise of fascism in Europe and Japan forced Britain to confront the possibility of global conflict once again, even as it remained focused on preserving its empire and recovering from economic instability. The cultural fabric of the empire also changed in these years. Advances in communication, radio, cinema, newspapers, meant that imperial subjects were more aware than ever of world events, political debates, and each other. Pan-African congresses, Islamic networks, Indian diaspora communities, and traveling, intellectuals helped to weave a more interconnected landscape of anti-colonial discourse. The very tools of imperial administration, schools, printed books, political institutions, became instruments of critique as educated colonial elites used imperial languages and legal frameworks to demand change. The tension between modernization and control became increasingly difficult to manage. By the end of the 1930s, the British Empire had weathered war, economic collapse, and internal unrest, but it had not emerged unscathed. Its core structures remained intact, but the balance had shifted. The dominions now moved independently, the colonies demanded reform, and the ideological foundations of empire were under scrutiny. The empire was still the largest political entity on Earth, but it now faced a world growing less tolerant of empires altogether. War and strain, the First World War, and the fracture of empire. In August 1914, the British Empire entered the First World War as a global entity with possessions on every continent and direct control over nearly 1/4 of the world's population. With Britain's declaration of war against Germany, its entire imperial system was drawn into conflict. No separate declarations were required. The dominions, colonies, protectorates, and mandates were considered legally and politically aligned with the metropole. What followed over the next 4 years was one of the most ambitious mobilizations of resources, people, and authority in the history of the empire. The war effort relied not just on British soldiers and factories, but on the contributions of Indian sepoys, Canadian infantrymen, Australian volunteers, African labourers, Caribbean Transport Corps, and supplies from plantations and ports from Lagos to Lahore. The scale of imperial involvement was unprecedented, and it revealed both the capabilities of the British imperial system and the tensions at its core. These tensions, rooted in inequalities of representation, access to power, and differential treatment, would only deepen as the war dragged on and sacrifices accumulated. The initial wave of support for the war effort across the empire was striking. In Canada, volunteers flooded recruitment offices in 1914, many driven by a sense of loyalty to Britain or a desire to assert their own national identities on the world stage. In Australia and New Zealand, calls to arms were met with widespread enthusiasm, with the belief that participation would solidify their emerging status as self-governing dominions within the imperial fold. South Africa, still divided in the aftermath of the Boer War, experienced a more complex response. While the government pledged support, internal dissent from Afrikaner nationalists culminated in a short-lived rebellion. In India, the princely states pledged men, money, and materials in large numbers, with some rulers personally financing warships or equipping battalions. Indian volunteers came not only from the traditional martial communities, such as Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Rajputs, but also from urban centers and rural villages, responding to a mix of loyalty, economic necessity, and the hope that service might advance claims for political reform. Over 1.4 million Indians would serve during the war, including more than 600,000 overseas, fighting in places as varied as Flanders, Gallipoli, East Africa, and Mesopotamia. Beyond the dominions and India, the wider empire also answered the call. In the West Indies, over 15,000 men volunteered to serve in the British West Indies Regiment, mostly assigned to labour and logistical roles under segregated conditions. In West Africa, tens of thousands of Africans were recruited or conscripted into service as carriers and porters, transporting supplies across difficult terrain in the East African campaign against German colonial forces. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Persian Gulf, Britain drew upon networks of local allies and colonial troops to maintain garrisons and secure transport routes. The empire's global infrastructure, its ports, coaling stations, railways, and telegraph cables became essential to the Allied war machine. Commodities flowed continuously: cotton from India, nitrates from Africa, sugar from the Caribbean, and troops from every corner of the empire. The war, more than any prior imperial conflict, demonstrated the logistical scope and administrative complexity of Britain's global system. But with mass mobilization came exposure to inequality. Soldiers from the colonies were often given inferior equipment, subjected to racist treatment by commanding officers, and excluded from leadership positions. Despite their bravery and sacrifice, colonial troops were rarely acknowledged on the same level as their white counterparts. Indian troops were praised in official communiques but rarely decorated. African and Caribbean regiments faced systematic segregation and were often relegated to menial roles. The disparities were not limited to military life. At home and across the empire, wartime censorship suppressed criticism, and colonial administrations grew more authoritarian in response to perceived threats of unrest. Political dissent was equated with disloyalty, and in many regions civil liberties were curtailed in the name of security. In India, nationalist organizations that had been advocating for self-government found themselves monitored, banned, or arrested under wartime emergency laws. Nevertheless, the experience of war transformed imperial subjects' relationship to Britain and the empire. Exposure to the brutality of European conflict, the shared experience of danger, and the contrast between promises made and actions taken produced a growing consciousness in many colonial societies. The discourse of loyalty and sacrifice was not one-sided. As Indian and African leaders pointed out, if their peoples had died for the empire, they expected a redefinition of the terms under which they were ruled. In India, the war accelerated the demands of the Indian National Congress for greater self-rule. Leaders like Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Annie Besant called for home rule, while others, including Mohandas Gandhi, who initially supported the war, began to question the imperial structure altogether. The Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919, which proposed limited provincial autonomy, were seen as inadequate. That same year, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, where British troops opened fire on a peaceful crowd, killing hundreds, radicalized large segments of Indian political opinion. The rhetoric of imperial duty was increasingly countered by the realities of imperial repression. In Egypt, the war years strained the British protectorate. Wartime requisitions, rising prices, and conscription efforts provoked anger. In 1919, a massive popular revolt led by nationalist figures like Saad Zaghloul erupted across the country. Strikes, protests, and attacks on infrastructure forced Britain to re-evaluate its position. Though nominal independence was granted in 1922, British military and political control remained significant. In other regions, too, post-war unrest grew. In Iraq, a revolt in 1920 challenged British rule, established during the war. In Palestine, where British forces had driven out the Ottomans, the conflicting promises made to Zionist and Arab leaders during the war began to surface, setting the stage for decades of contestation. The Dominions, while not seeking independence in the immediate sense, emerged from the war with new political confidence. Canada's performance at Vimy Ridge, the sacrifices of Australian troops at Gallipoli, and the military campaigns undertaken by South African forces in German Southwest Africa and East Africa elevated the international standing of these countries. Their leaders participated in the 1919 Paris Peace Conference and signed the Treaty of Versailles as separate entities. The Statute of Westminster, though not passed until 1931, had its roots in the new status achieved by Dominion governments during the war. The transformation was more than symbolic. It represented a shift from colonial dependency to equal partnership, at least among white settler colonies. The post-war period also saw Britain acquire new territories under the League of Nations mandate system. Former German and Ottoman territories, including parts of the Middle East and Africa, were placed under British control with the official justification of preparing them for self-rule. In practice, these mandates extended imperial reach. Britain assumed control of Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq in the Middle East, and German Cameroon and Tanganyika in Africa. While framed as trusteeships, these territories were integrated into imperial administrative and economic networks. The rhetoric of guardianship served to legitimize continued expansion at a moment when formal annexation had fallen out of favor. Domestically, the war had altered British society. The economic strain was severe, debts mounted, and wartime production had disrupted trade patterns. The loss of life and the psychological toll on British society were immense. Millions of men returned wounded physically or mentally, and the trauma of trench warfare haunted public memory. The idea of empire, once celebrated with confidence, was now more complex. Public enthusiasm for imperial conquest waned, even as political leaders insisted on the necessity of maintaining global influence. At the same time, new technologies, aircraft, radio, automobiles, were transforming communications and the projection of power. Imperial administration became more reliant on information systems, statistical surveillance, and bureaucratic structures designed to manage distant populations with efficiency. For colonial subjects, especially those who had fought, labored, or contributed economically, the war became a reference point in the emerging discourse of rights and recognition. They had participated not as passive auxiliaries, but as active agents, often in uniform, carrying arms and engaging in battle. Their awareness of their own contribution shifted expectations. Political movements began to organize around the language of citizenship, sacrifice, and shared struggle. The legitimacy of empire was increasingly tied to its ability to deliver, reform, and acknowledge the role of its subjects. Where that recognition failed to materialize, resistance grew, sometimes incrementally, sometimes in bursts of open defiance. The First World War had not shattered the British Empire. In many ways, it had reinforced the empire's global structure, mobilizing its full capacity for war and securing new territories in the aftermath. But it had also exposed fault lines that would deepen in the decades ahead. The asymmetries of service and reward, the expectations raised by shared sacrifice, and the sheer complexity of maintaining authority over such a vast and diverse political entity under growing internal and external pressure began to reshape the imperial project. The empire emerged from the war larger than ever before, yet less stable. Its resources had been stretched, its contradictions laid bare, and its subjects more politicized than ever. The strain of war had not broken the empire, but it had fundamentally changed the relationship between ruler and ruled. The Second World War and the Unraveling. When war was declared in September 1939, the British Empire again mobilized on a global scale, as it had done in 1914. This time, however, the geopolitical landscape was different. The interwar period had left behind deep fractures, political, economic, and ideological, and the capacity of the empire to manage a second world conflict without internal strain was already diminished. Nonetheless, Britain's declaration of war against Nazi Germany once again activated not only the metropole, but the entire imperial network. The dominions pledged support swiftly, although with greater independence in how they framed and conducted their participation. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa entered the war as autonomous actors, emphasizing their sovereign decision to support the Allied cause. India, however, was declared at war without consultation, a move that would have lasting political consequences. The mobilization was vast. From India alone, more than 2.5 million men would ultimately serve in the war, the largest volunteer force in history at that time. Troops were deployed in nearly every major theater, from North Africa to Southeast Asia, from the Middle East to the Mediterranean. African colonies contributed soldiers, laborers, and raw materials, with British West and East Africa providing hundreds of thousands of troops who fought in campaigns in Ethiopia, Burma, and Italy. The Caribbean sent soldiers, airmen, and technical personnel, and also served as a strategic site for Allied naval activity in the Atlantic. Canada became a crucial centre for training aircrew under the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan and provided enormous logistical and material support. Australia and New Zealand, while initially committed to the European front, shifted their attention toward the Pacific, following Japan's entry into the war in 1941 and the fall of Singapore. Singapore's capture by Japanese forces in February 1942 marked a psychological rupture in the history of British imperial power. For decades, the city had been touted as an impregnable symbol of British strength in Asia, its fortifications a deterrent to any external threat. But the Japanese advanced through Malaya rapidly, bypassing much of Britain's naval capacity and exploiting weaknesses in defensive planning. The fall of Singapore was not merely a military defeat, it was a symbolic dismantling of imperial authority in the East. Tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth troops were taken prisoner for colonial subjects who had been taught to believe in the permanence and superiority of British power. The event revealed the vulnerability of the imperial centre. In India, nationalist leaders interpreted the collapse as further justification for demanding immediate independence. The Indian nationalist movement, already galvanized in the 1930s, intensified during the war. The Indian National Congress, under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, objected to the unilateral declaration of war and demanded full self-government as the price of cooperation. The British government responded by sending the Cripps Mission in 1942, offering post-war dominion status but withholding any immediate transfer of power. Congress rejected the offer and launched the Quit India movement, calling for mass civil disobedience. British authorities responded with mass arrests, banning Congress and imprisoning its leaders for the duration of the war. Despite the repression, the movement's reach revealed the deepening legitimacy crisis of British rule in India. At the same time, other Indian political currents moved in different directions. Subhas Chandra Bose, a former Congress leader allied with Axis powers to form the Indian National Army, INA, composed largely of Indian prisoners of war and expatriates in Southeast Asia. The INA fought alongside Japanese forces in Burma and northeastern India, and although ultimately defeated, the very fact of its existence created anxiety in Britain about the depth of nationalist sentiment within the Indian armed forces. After the war, trials of INA officers drew enormous public attention and sympathy in India, further eroding colonial authority. The economic toll of the war was immense. British colonies were required to fund parts of the war effort themselves, contributing not only manpower but also materials, taxes, and currency reserves. India, in particular, was forced into an unfavourable financial arrangement, accumulating what were known as sterling balances, credits held in London that could not be freely spent. The system benefited Britain, which was under heavy financial strain, but intensified resentment among Indian political and business elites. In Bengal, wartime disruption of rice supplies and failures in colonial response led to the famine of 1943, which caused the deaths of up to 3 million people. Though caused by multiple factors, crop failures, inflation, hoarding and transport shortages, the famine revealed the structural weaknesses of colonial governance under stress and prompted sharp criticism from Indian and international observers. In Africa, the war also had a transformative effect. Soldiers from across the continent fought under British command, gaining new experiences, skills and awareness. In West Africa, thousands served in regiments that fought in Burma, while East African troops took part in campaigns against Italian forces in Ethiopia and Eritrea. The war opened up new opportunities for African officers and exposed many to ideas of self-determination and political equality. After demobilization, returning soldiers often became involved in early nationalist movements, forming unions, political parties and veterans associations that would shape post-war African politics. Economic exploitation during the war also left its mark. Forced labor, price controls, and food requisitions caused hardship and discontent in both urban and rural areas. These wartime grievances merged with longer-standing critiques of colonial rule. In the Caribbean, the war accelerated social change. Thousands of men and women joined the armed forces or participated in auxiliary services, and many migrated to Britain or the United States to support war industries. The economic stimulus of wartime production, however, was uneven, and many islands continued to suffer from chronic unemployment and underdevelopment. The post-war period saw growing demands for labor rights, political reform, and greater local autonomy. In Jamaica and Trinidad, the labor unrest of the late 1930s returned in the form of organized political movements that would soon lead to universal suffrage and the emergence of new political leadership. Throughout the empire, the war produced a shift in the expectations of imperial subjects. The rhetoric of freedom, democracy, and anti-fascism, central to Allied propaganda, was not lost on those living under colonial rule. If Britain claimed to be fighting for liberty, many asked, then how could it continue to govern without consent? The contradiction was increasingly untenable. Meanwhile, Britain's capacity to manage its empire was strained not only by military commitments, but by economic exhaustion. The war had cost Britain dearly. It had borrowed heavily from the United States, sold off investments, and drained its gold reserves. In the immediate post-war years, Britain faced shortages, rationing, and widespread austerity. The empire had helped win the war, but maintaining it in peacetime would require resources that were no longer readily available. In 1945, as the war came to an end in Europe and the Pacific, Britain emerged victorious but transformed. At home, the general election brought the Labour Party to power, committed to building a welfare state and focusing on domestic reconstruction. While Labour did not initially advocate decolonisation as a political platform, it recognised that imperial administration had to change. Britain now presided over a network of territories that were demanding reform, recognition, or independence, each with its own tempo and leadership. India was the most immediate challenge. Negotiations resumed in earnest, and by 1947, under the Viceroyalty of Lord Mountbatten, British officials agreed to a partitioned withdrawal. India and Pakistan were born out of division, violence, and hurried agreements, ending over a century and a half of direct British rule on the subcontinent. The transfer of power occurred amid communal riots, mass displacement, and political uncertainty. Yet it also marked a watershed, the end of Britain's most important imperial possession and the symbolic beginning of empire's disintegration. Other parts of the empire followed, though more slowly. In the Middle East, Britain faced growing resistance in Palestine, where Jewish paramilitary organizations accelerated the campaign for statehood. In Africa and the Caribbean, nationalist movements gained strength, supported by returning veterans, urban workers, students, and intellectuals. Across the empire, constitutional reforms expanded local participation in government, but the demands of post-war reconstruction in Britain often limited what could be offered in practice. Meanwhile, the global context was changing. The emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers placed new constraints on imperial behavior. American support for decolonization, though selective and cautious, contributed to the broader erosion of legitimacy for colonial empires. The formation of the United Nations in 1945 introduced new international frameworks for self-determination and human rights, further pressuring imperial powers to justify their presence. Colonial subjects increasingly appealed to international bodies, joined global anti-colonial networks, and adopted the language of universal rights. The Cold War, while opening space for imperial cooperation with Western allies, also created opportunities for nationalist movements to gain support, either implicitly or explicitly, from rival ideological blocs. By the late 1940s, the British Empire remained a global presence, but the process of unraveling was already underway. India's independence had demonstrated that Britain could no longer impose its will indefinitely, and nationalist movements in other regions drew strength from that example. The costs of war, both material and ideological, had accelerated a transformation that had already begun between the wars. Britain could still project power, but it now had to negotiate with forces that no longer saw imperial rule as inevitable or acceptable. The Second World War had not simply tested the empire, it had exposed its limits. The idea of imperial permanence, so entrenched in the early 20th century, had been replaced by a new reality, an empire under pressure, navigating the demands of a world increasingly unwilling to be ruled from afar. Winds of change, decolonization, and the end of empire. The years following the Second World War marked the most dramatic and irreversible transformation in the history of the British Empire. Between 1947 and the early 1970s, Britain relinquished direct control over the vast majority of its colonies, protectorates, and mandated territories, culminating in a post-imperial landscape shaped more by diplomacy, trade, and migration than by conquest or command. The process of decolonization unfolded unevenly and was influenced by a complex mix of internal and external forces. Nationalist movements, economic strain, shifting international norms, and the Cold War all contributed to a momentum that even the most committed imperial administrators came to recognize as unstoppable. The so-called winds of change, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan would famously call them in 1960, were no longer gusts. They had become gales. The first major blow came in 1947 with the partition and independence of India and Pakistan. After decades of nationalist agitation, non-cooperation, and constitutional negotiation, Britain accepted that its position in the subcontinent was no longer tenable. A combination of economic exhaustion, administrative overreach, and civil unrest convinced the post-war Labour government that immediate withdrawal was necessary. The partition, hastily negotiated and executed under Lord Mountbatten's supervision, divided British India along religious lines into two sovereign states, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The process unleashed communal violence on an enormous scale, displacing over 10 million people and resulting in the deaths of as many as 1 million. While independence was widely celebrated, the partition cast a long shadow over the legacy of British withdrawal, underscoring the difficulties of dismantling a colonial structure deeply entangled with questions of identity, power, and history. The precedent set by India quickly reverberated throughout the empire. In Southeast Asia, nationalist movements that had already gained momentum before the war were emboldened. In Burma, now Myanmar, the anti-fascist People's Freedom League, led by Aung San, negotiated independence with the British government, and Burma became a sovereign republic in January 1948. Unlike many other parts of the empire, it did not join the Commonwealth. In Ceylon, Sri Lanka, constitutional negotiations led to a peaceful transition, and the country gained dominion status. In the same year, these cases demonstrated the preference of British policymakers, when possible, to manage withdrawal through negotiation and legal procedure rather than prolonged conflict. Elsewhere, however, the path to independence proved far more violent and contested. In Malaya, a communist insurgency erupted in 1948, leading to a prolonged conflict known as the Malayan Emergency. Although the rebellion was largely suppressed by British and Commonwealth forces through a combination of military campaigns and counterinsurgency tactics, the political solution was a gradual constitutional process culminating in independence in 1957. The strategic and economic importance of Malaya, particularly its rubber and tin industries, meant that British interest in retaining influence remained high, and the post-independence government retained close ties with London. In the Middle East, the limits of British imperial control were increasingly exposed. In Palestine, Britain struggled to contain the conflict between Jewish and Arab nationalist movements. Mandated by the League of Nations after the First World War to administer the territory, Britain found itself unable to reconcile competing promises made during the war and growing violence on the ground. In 1947, unable to maintain order or find a political solution acceptable to both sides, Britain referred the matter to the newly created United Nations, which proposed a partition plan. The withdrawal in 1948 led to the declaration of the State of Israel and the First Arab-Israeli War. Britain's retreat from Palestine marked one of the most chaotic and contested ends to a colonial mandate, with legacies that would persist in regional politics for decades. In Africa, the process of decolonization unfolded in stages and varied widely in character. The Gold Coast became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence, transforming into Ghana in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah, educated abroad and deeply influenced by Pan-Africanism, had built a mass political movement capable of pressing for rapid decolonization. His success inspired similar campaigns across the continent. In Nigeria, a federated structure was negotiated throughout the 1950s, culminating in independence in 1960. In Kenya, however, nationalist aspirations were met with fierce resistance. The Mau Mau uprising, launched by members of the Kikuyu ethnic group in the early 1950s, challenged colonial land policy and demanded self-rule. The British response involved mass arrests, military action, and the establishment of detention camps. The conflict, while officially declared over by 1956, significantly shaped the pace and tone of Kenyan independence, which was finally achieved in 1963. Other territories followed suit. Tanganyika, later Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia gained independence in the early 1960s. In Central Africa, the British had attempted to preserve a multiracial federation, the Central African Federation, uniting Northern Rhodesia, Southern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland. This arrangement was opposed by African nationalists, and under mounting pressure, it was dissolved by 1963. Nyasaland became Malawi, Northern Rhodesia became Zambia, and Southern Rhodesia would later declare unilateral independence under a white minority government, setting the stage for a prolonged conflict that would only end in 1980 with the creation of Zimbabwe. Decolonization in North Africa followed a similar arc. In Egypt, formal independence had been granted in 1922, but British troops remained stationed in the Suez Canal zone. Rising nationalist agitation, culminating in the Free Officers' Coup of 1952, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, eventually forced The withdrawal of British forces in 1956, that same year, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military operation to regain control of the Suez Canal after its nationalization by Nasser. The Suez Crisis proved to be a turning point. Although militarily successful in the short term, the operation was condemned internationally and brought swift political backlash from the United States and the United Nations. Britain was forced to withdraw under pressure, and the episode exposed its declining influence in the post-war world. The illusion of Britain as a global imperial power was shattered for many at home and abroad. The Caribbean and Pacific regions saw a more gradual and less conflictual path toward independence. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, many British Caribbean colonies gained internal self-government, and full independence followed in the 1960s and 70s, Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago in 1962, Barbados in 1966, and others later. The Pacific Islands followed a similar trajectory, with Fiji gaining independence in 1970, Papua New Guinea in 1975, and other smaller territories negotiating their own arrangements. Many of these newly independent states chose to remain in the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of former British territories that symbolized continuity without control. Throughout this process, the structure of the Commonwealth itself evolved. Once a collection of dominions dominated by white settler societies, it gradually became a more inclusive organization. The admission of non-white, non-dominion states transformed it into a global platform for diplomacy and shared interests, though without legal or political binding force. For Britain, the Commonwealth provided a means of maintaining soft influence and fostering post-imperial relationships. For former colonies, it offered a space for dialogue, aid, and cultural exchange, even as they pursued their own trajectories. Economically, the post-imperial transition was shaped by broader global changes. The rise of the United States as the dominant Western economic and military power, the formation of the European Economic Community, and the decline of Britain's industrial competitiveness all weakened the rationale for a formal empire. Sterling devaluations, balance of payments crises, and IMF bailouts signaled the economic limits of imperial overstretch. At the same time, Britain's post-war welfare state and social programs required attention and resources at home. Maintaining a far-flung empire was increasingly seen as incompatible with domestic reconstruction. The Cold War, too, influenced the pace and nature of decolonization. Western powers, particularly the United States, pressured European allies to grant independence in order to prevent newly independent countries from drifting into Soviet alignment. Anti-colonial movements, from Algeria to Angola, were viewed through a geopolitical lens, with competing blocs seeking to influence outcomes. British policymakers, while reluctant to abandon influence, often presented decolonization as a strategy to maintain Western alignment among emerging states. Development aid, military assistance, and diplomatic support became tools of a new kind of imperial relationship, one no longer predicated on direct rule, but on strategic partnership. By the early 1970s, the British Empire as it had existed for centuries had largely disappeared. A few territories remained: Hong Kong, Gibraltar, the Falkland Islands, and scattered island possessions, but the age of formal imperial expansion was over. In 1997, the transfer of Hong Kong to the People's Republic of China marked the final major act in the long process of decolonization. Britain's role in the world had changed, and with it, the identity of the empire's successor state. What remained were memories, institutions, trade links, and diasporas. Across the former empire, British influence could still be seen in parliaments, legal codes, languages, railways, cricket fields, and school curricula, but the political authority that had once bound so many millions to a distant monarch and parliament had dissolved. After empire, memory, migration, and the legacy of the British imperial world. When the formal structures of the British Empire began to collapse in the mid-20th century, what followed was not a clean rupture, but a long and complex afterlife. Political sovereignty may have shifted to new capitals, Delhi, Accra, Kingston, Kuala Lumpur, but the social, economic, and cultural legacies of empire did not vanish. Instead, they migrated, morphed, and embedded themselves in unexpected ways. The end of empire was not simply a matter of independence days and flag ceremonies. It was a transformation of global relationships, identities, and narratives that would continue to evolve through the late 20th and into the 21st century. One of the most immediate and tangible consequences of decolonization was human movement. As the empire fractured, its former subjects moved, sometimes by invitation, sometimes by necessity, toward the former metropole. In the decades following World War II, Britain experienced a significant wave of migration from the Caribbean, South Asia, and Africa. Many of these migrants were former colonial citizens who had fought in the war, supported the empire economically, or sought new opportunities in what was still imagined as the imperial center. The arrival of the Empire Windrush in 1948, carrying hundreds of Caribbean workers to Britain, became emblematic of this era. Over the next 2 decades, thousands would follow, shaping the cultural and demographic fabric of British cities. South Asians from India, Pakistan, and later Bangladesh arrived in increasing numbers, many settling in industrial towns in the Midlands and North. East African Asians expelled from Uganda in the 1970s were granted refuge in Britain, further diversifying the post-imperial migration landscape. These movements were not only economic but deeply tied to the imperial past. The legal categories of British subjecthood, the English language, educational systems, and even cricket, all connected new arrivals to the structures they had once lived under. Yet migration did not occur in a vacuum. The presence of former colonial subjects in Britain challenged assumptions about national identity, belonging, and race. While many migrants came with a sense of familiarity, believing in a shared Commonwealth connection, they were often met with hostility, suspicion, or outright violence. The 1958 Notting Hill riots in London, the rise of the National Front and the 1970s and public debates about immigration caps revealed the contested nature of post-imperial Britain. At the same time, new communities took root, transforming British cuisine, fashion, politics, and urban culture. The empire had come home, not as conquest, but as coexistence, often uneasy, sometimes joyful, always transformative. Meanwhile, the Commonwealth continued to exist, reimagined as a voluntary association of sovereign states linked by history, language, and shared values. It served as a symbolic framework through which Britain could maintain global ties without formal authority. Membership expanded well beyond. The original dominions and colonies, encompassing republics, monarchies, and states that had never been formally colonized by Britain. The Commonwealth Games, summits, and development programs provided spaces for cooperation and visibility, though the organization remained loose and without binding power. For some former colonies, the Commonwealth was a reminder of past exploitation. For others, it became a diplomatic platform. For Britain, it offered a way to navigate a post-imperial role in the world. But not all imperial legacies could be transformed into diplomacy. In many former colonies, the effects of British rule continued to shape national debates long after independence. Legal systems based on British common law, educational curricula centered on English literature and history, administrative languages, and inherited political structures endured, sometimes harmoniously, often contentiously. Post-colonial writers, thinkers, and activists critiqued the lingering cultural and psychological imprints of empire. Authors like Chinua Achebe, V.S. Naipaul, Arundhati Roy, and Salman Rushdie explored the tensions of identity, memory, and hybridity born from colonial histories. University curricula expanded to include post-colonial studies, and museums increasingly grappled with questions of restitution, representation, and historical accountability. In Britain itself, public memory of empire remained ambiguous. For much of the 20th century, empire was remembered selectively through schoolbooks, war memorials, and nostalgic television dramas. Popular culture often presented sanitized versions of colonial life, emphasizing adventure, heroism, and benevolent governance, while omitting violence, resistance, and exploitation. But by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, these narratives were increasingly challenged. Debates erupted over statues of imperial figures, the contents of national museums, and the way history was taught in schools. Campaigns like Rhodes Must Fall and the push to decolonize the curriculum reflected a broader reckoning with the imperial past, not only in former colonies, but in Britain itself. Nowhere were the legacies of empire more pronounced, and its unraveling more symbolic, than in Hong Kong. Acquired in stages through war and diplomacy, first in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, then expanded through the Kowloon Peninsula and finally the new territories under a 99-year lease in 1898, Hong Kong became one of Britain's most profitable and strategically important colonial outposts. It was a centre of trade, finance, and cultural hybridity, blending Cantonese traditions with British institutions. For over a century, it operated as a crown colony, with a British-appointed governor, a largely Chinese population, and an economy increasingly integrated with global capitalism. As the lease on the new territories approached expiration in the late 20th century, it became clear that Britain could not retain Hong Kong indefinitely. Negotiations with the People's Republic of China culminated in the Sino-British Joint Declaration of 1984, in which Britain agreed to return the entire territory to China in 1997 under the principle of one country, two systems. The agreement promised that Hong Kong's capitalist system, legal protections, and partial political autonomy would remain in place for 50 years after the handover. The British government oversaw a period of reforms in the 1980s and 90s, including modest democratization and legal guarantees, but it was China's rising power that set the terms. The handover ceremony on the 1st July 1997 marked the final chapter of Britain's imperial story. At midnight, the Union Jack was lowered, the Hong Kong police band played God Save the Queen for the last time, and Prince Charles, representing the Crown, departed. For many, it was a moment of sadness, closure, and reflection. Hong Kong's return was peaceful and orderly, but it highlighted the asymmetry of power in the new global order. Britain had entered the 19th century as a rising empire in Asia and left the 20th century as a secondary actor, making diplomatic accommodations to rising superpowers. The post-handover years saw Hong Kong maintain its distinctive character, but political tensions gradually intensified. Pro-democracy protests in 2014 and 2019 challenged the erosion of promised freedoms. Britain, now with no colonial authority, became a vocal critic of Chinese policy, offering residency pathways to British national overseas passport holders. The episode underscored how imperial legacies can remain active even after formal sovereignty has passed, through identity, law, memory, and international responsibility. In the broader world, former imperial connections continue to shape migration, trade, and diplomacy. The English language remains a powerful global medium. Legal and political systems across dozens of countries carry the imprint of British governance, and diasporic communities maintain ties that transcend national boundaries. The idea of empire today exists less as a political entity than as a historical structure that continues to shape the world in ways both visible and subtle. In cities like London, Toronto, Nairobi, Mumbai, and Sydney, The legacy of empire is embedded in demographics, institutions, street names, and public debates. The British Empire did not vanish in 1947 or 1957 or even in 1997. It transformed, reconfigured, and dispersed. What was once a vertical hierarchy of control is now a horizontal web of connections, some inherited, others contested, many deeply personal. For millions of people around the world, empire is part of family history, cultural identity, and political struggle. It is not only about what was taken or given, but about what remains.